Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Thomas Bridgewater, but everyone calls me Tom. I've been a park ranger for 15 years now, working the George Washington National Forest here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. In all that time, I never lost a kid, not once. Brought home plenty of scared children who wandered off hiking trails, reunited families who got separated in the fog, even pulled a few teenagers out of abandoned mine shafts they had no business exploring. But September of 1976 changed everything. That's when I learned some children don't want to be found because they're not really lost. I should probably tell you why I got into this work. My sister's boy, Danny, fell into a ravine during a family camping trip when he was 8 years old. Took us 3 days to find his body. 3 days of my sister screaming his name into those empty mountains. I swore that day no other family would go through what we did. Guess that was stupid of me, thinking I could protect everyone. The Devil's Backbone Ridge sits about 25 miles from the nearest town. It's old coal mining country, full of played-out shafts and rotting company houses from the 1920s. Most folks avoid it now. The roads washed out years ago, and there's not much to see except rusted equipment and bad memories. But some families still camp there, drawn by the solitude and the cheap permit fees. That's where the Hendricks family went missing. Jim and Sarah Hendricks, both school teachers from Richmond, had brought their 8-year-old daughter Emma for what they called a real wilderness experience. They'd registered for a 3-day camping permit and were supposed to check out Friday morning. When they didn't show, and their emergency contact couldn't reach them by Saturday evening, the call came to me. I drove out Sunday morning with my partner Beth Williams. Beth was newer to the job, but sharp as a tack. She'd transferred from the Coast Guard, and brought a no-nonsense attitude that I respected. We found the Hendricks car parked at the old mining road trailhead, covered in morning dew like it had been there all night. "Radio working okay?" Beth asked as we checked our equipment. The Motorola HT-220s we used could be finicky in the mountains. "Clear as a bell," I said, testing the connection with base camp. "You got the compass?" She held up her Silva Model 15. "Never leave home without it." We hiked the main trail about 2 miles before we found their campsite. Everything looked normal at first glance. Tent still standing, sleeping bags laid out neat, camp stove clean and put away proper. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but the air itself seemed too still. "Where is everyone?" Beth asked, circling the tent. No signs of a struggle. Food still packed away correct, so bears didn't get into it. I knelt by the cold fire ring. The ashes were bone dry, like they'd been there for days instead of hours. "Check for tracks." We found boot prints leading away from camp toward the old mine entrance about a 1/4 mile east. Adult prints and small ones that had to be Emma's. The trail was easy to follow at first, clear impressions in the soft soil. But about halfway to the mine, something strange happened. The tracks just stopped. Not like they were covered up or washed away. They literally ended in the middle of a clear patch of ground, like the family had just vanished into thin air. "That's impossible," Beth said, crouching next to the last footprint. "People don't just disappear." I called it into base camp, requesting additional search teams and maybe a helicopter if the weather held. While we waited, I tried to piece together what might have happened. Maybe they doubled back, tried to confuse any trackers. Maybe there was some kind of accident and the survivors had carried the injured in a different direction. But deep down, I knew something else was going on. The mountains felt wrong that morning. Too quiet. No bird songs, no insect. Buzzing, no squirrels chattering in the trees. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow. "Tom," Beth called from near the mine entrance. "You need to see this." She was standing about 50 feet from the old shaft, pointing at the ground. "Look at this moss." The The moss covering the rocks near the mine was arranged in perfect circles, like someone had been playing a game. But moss doesn't grow in patterns like that. It spreads random, following moisture and shade. Kids, maybe? I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. What kids? The Hendricks girl? Why would she arrange moss while her parents were missing? I pulled out my radio. Base, this is Bridgewater. We need those search teams now. Something's not right out here. Static answered me. Then more static. The radio was working fine 5 minutes ago. Mine shaft's probably full of old equipment, Beth said, checking her own radio with the same result. Lots of metal can mess with signals. But I've worked around old mines before. Radio interference is common, sure, but this felt different. This felt like something was listening to our conversations and didn't want us calling for help. By noon, we'd covered about a 3-mile radius around the campsite with no sign of the family. The search dogs arrived around 1 o'clock, 2 German shepherds with handlers from the county sheriff's department. Those dogs could track a scent through running water and over rock faces. They were the best in the state. But when we brought them to the last set of footprints, both dogs did something I'd never seen before. They started whining and backing away, ears flat against their heads. One of them, a big male named Rex, actually started shaking. What's wrong with them? I asked the handler, a guy named Bill Morris who'd worked with tracking dogs for 20 years. Never seen anything like it, Bill said, trying to coax Rex forward. It's like they're terrified of something, but there's nothing here. We tried leading the dogs to different spots around the mine area. Same reaction every time. The closer we got to the shaft, the more agitated they became. Finally, Bill had to take them back to the truck. Dogs know things we don't, Beth said quietly. Maybe we should listen to them. But I couldn't give up. Somewhere out there, a family needed help. I'd made a promise 15 years ago, and I intended to keep it. Around 3 o'clock, we got our first real break. One of the volunteer searchers, a local guy named Pete Crawford, came running back to base camp with news. I saw the little girl, he said, breathing hard, down by the mine entrance. She was playing with some other kids. Other kids? I asked. What other kids? I don't know. 4, maybe 5 of them, playing some kind of game in a circle. Ring around the rosy or something like that. My blood went cold. There were no other families registered for camping permits in that area, and Ring Around the Rosie isn't a game you play in abandoned mine country. Did you talk to her? Tried to, but when I called out, the other kids just vanished. Poof, gone like they were never there. The little girl, Emma, right? She looked at me and said she was playing with her new friends. Said they wanted to play forever. Beth and I exchanged glances. Show us, I said. Pete led us back toward the mine, but about 100 yards out he stopped dead in his tracks. That's weird. I could have sworn the entrance was right here. But there was no entrance. Just solid rock face and a tangle of old mining equipment. We walked the entire area twice, checking every outcropping and depression. Nothing. I'm telling you, there was a mine shaft right here, Pete insisted. Big as life. I saw it clear as day. That's when I noticed my compass was spinning. Not just drifting a little, which happens sometimes near metal deposits. Spinning like a carnival ride, unable to find magnetic north. Beth, check your compass. Hers was doing the same thing. We walked in different directions, and about 200 yards away, both compasses settled down and pointed true north again. But in that area around where Pete swore he'd seen the mine entrance, they went crazy. Electromagnetic disturbance, Beth said, but she didn't sound convinced. Old mining equipment sometimes does that. As the sun started getting lower, we set up base camp about half a mile from the mine area. I called for more volunteers and requested geological survey maps of all the mine shafts in the region. There were 17 registered shafts within a 5-mile radius, but the 1920s maps showed at least 30 more that had been sealed or abandoned. That night, sitting around our camp stove eating cold sandwiches, Beth asked the question that had been bothering me all day. Tom, what if they didn't wander off? What if something took them? Took them where? I don't know, but think about it. No tracks past a certain point. Dogs won't go near the area. Our equipment's going haywire. That volunteer seeing kids who vanish into thin air. I wanted to tell her she was being ridiculous. In 15 years of search and rescue, I'd never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by natural causes, human error, or bad luck. But I'd also never seen dogs react like that, or compasses spin like tops, or moss grow in perfect circles. Let's say you're right, I said. Let's say something unnatural is going on. What do we do about it? Find those people and bring them home. Same as always. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard children laughing somewhere in the distance. Faint at first, like an echo carried on the wind. But as the hours passed, it got closer and clearer. Happy laughter, the kind you hear on playgrounds and in backyards during summer evenings. Except we were 25 miles from the nearest town, and it was nearly October. Around 4 in the morning, I got up to check the perimeter. The laughter stopped the second I unzipped my sleeping bag, like whoever was making it knew I was listening. I walked to the edge of our camp and peered into the darkness. Nothing moved in the forest. No wind, no animal sounds, no night insects buzzing. Just that unnatural silence that had been following us all day. But on the ground at my feet, I found something that made my skin crawl. Fresh footprints, child-sized. Leading from the forest into our camp, circling our tent 3 times, then leading back into the darkness. The prints were so fresh I could see individual tread marks from small sneakers. But I'd been awake on and off all night, and I'd heard no footsteps, no rustling leaves or snapping twigs. Nothing. I followed the tracks with my flashlight until they reached the tree line, where they simply vanished again, just like the Hendricks family's prints had done. When I got back to the tent, Beth was sitting up in her sleeping bag. "Couldn't sleep either," she asked. "Did you hear anything? Footsteps, maybe?" "Just that laughing. Sounded like kids playing. Which is impossible, right?" I showed her the prints by flashlight. In the morning, we'd photograph them and add them to our evidence file. But both of us knew we were dealing with something that wouldn't fit in any official report. "Tomorrow, we're going into that mine," I said. "Whatever's down there, that's where we'll find the Hendricks family." "What if we don't like what we find?" I didn't have an answer for that. I just knew that somewhere in those mountains, a little girl named Emma was playing games with children who might not be children at all, and time was running out. Dawn brought fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. It rolled through the valleys like something alive, pooling in the hollows and hanging bet, weaned the trees like gray curtains. But this wasn't normal mountain fog. It moved against the wind, forming shapes that almost looked like people if you caught them from the corner of your tozul eye. Beth and I packed light for the mine exploration. Flashlights, rope, first aid kit, extra batteries, and a Polaroid camera to document anything we found. I also brought something else, a small iron railroad spike I'd picked up from the old mining equipment. Call it superstition, but my grandmother always said iron keeps bad things away. The mine entrance that Pete Crawford swore he'd seen was there again, as clear as day. A dark opening in the rock face about 6 feet high, with rotting timber supports that looked ready to collapse at any second. Rusty cart rails led into the darkness, disappearing around a bend about 50 feet in. "This wasn't here yesterday," Beth said, checking her notes. "I walked this exact spot twice. Maybe the fog's playing tricks on us." But we both knew that was nonsense. You don't just miss a mine entrance that size, especially when you're looking for one. I tested the radio again. Still nothing but static within 200 yards of the shaft. "If we're not back in 4 hours, the search teams will come looking. What if they can't find the entrance either? Then we better not need rescuing." The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, supported by timber posts that creaked and groaned as we passed. Our flashlight beams cut through air thick with coal dust and something else, a sweet smell like bubblegum and crayons. The smell of childhood. About 100 yards in, we found the first toy. It was a little wooden horse on wheels, painted red and yellow, sitting right in the middle of the cart tracks like someone had just put it down. The paint was faded but not weathered, and when I picked it up, it felt warm. "That's not from the 1920s, Beth said, examining it with her flashlight. "Paint's too bright, wood's too clean." We photographed it and kept moving. The tunnel branched in 3 directions about 200 yards from the E entrance. The main passage continued straight ahead, while smaller tunnels split off to the left and right. I was studying the map, trying to figure out which way to go, when Beth grabbed my arm. Listen. Children's voices echoed from somewhere deep in the mine. Not crying or calling for help, but singing. A nursery rhyme I remembered from my own childhood. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. We all fall down. The voices were coming from the left tunnel. Emma, I called out. Emma Hendricks, this is Ranger Bridgewater. Your parents sent us to find you. The singing stopped. For a moment, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then a child's voice answered, sweet and clear. We're playing a game. Do you want to play too? It was a little girl, but I couldn't tell if it was Emma or someone else. The acoustics in the mine made it impossible to judge distance or direction. We just want to help you get home, Beth called out. We are home, came the reply. We've been home for a very long time. I led the way down the left tunnel, following the cart tracks deeper into the mountain. Our flashlights picked up more toys as we went. A cloth doll with button eyes, a wooden top, a set of marbles that clicked together when I accidentally kicked them. But these toys were old, really old. The doll's fabric was yellowed with age, and the wooden top was worn smooth from countless hands. These weren't Emma's toys. These belonged to children from decades ago. The tunnel opened into a large chamber carved from solid coal. Mining equipment sat rusted and abandoned around the walls. Pickaxes, shovels, cartwheels, and coils of rotten rope. But in the center of the chamber, someone had created a playroom. Toys were arranged in neat rows on the floor, a tea set with tiny cups and saucers. Building blocks spelling out names I didn't recognize. Jump ropes and jacks and wooden hoops from a time when children made their own entertainment. And carved into the coal walls, 47 names with dates. All children, all from 1926. Jesus Christ, Beth whispered, running her flashlight over the names. Thomas Akins, age 7. Mary Beth Cooper, age 9. James Sullivan, age 12. She paused. Tom, these are all from the same year. I counted them twice. 47 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14. All with death dates of March 15th, 1926. The mine disaster, I said, remembering the old newspaper stories. There was a collapse in 26. They said 47 people died, but I thought they meant miners. These weren't miners. Look at the ages. Child labor in the mines wasn't uncommon in the 1920s. Families needed the money, and small hands could work in tight spaces where adults couldn't fit. But 47 children dying in a single collapse? That wasn't an accident. That was a massacre. The Polaroid camera flashed as Beth documented the wall carvings. But when the picture developed, something impossible appeared in the image. Small handprints pressed into the coal around each name, as if the children had signed their own memorial. Handprints that weren't visible to our eyes. We need to get out of here, Beth said, staring at the photograph. Not without the Hendricks family. That's when we heard the footsteps. Small feet running on stone coming from deeper in the mine system. And voices. Lots of voices, all singing the same nursery rhyme. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. We all fall down. But this time, they didn't stop at fall down. They kept singing verses I'd never heard. Buried in the darkness, where the coal dust settles, come and play forever in our mining kettle. I followed the sound down a side passage, Beth close behind me. The tunnel was smaller here, barely wide enough for an adult. Perfect size for children. We found them in a chamber that shouldn't have existed. Emma Hendricks sat in a circle with 6 other children, all holding hands. Her parents, Jim and Sarah, sat against the far wall like mannequins, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. They were breathing, but when I called their names, they didn't respond. The other children in the circle looked exactly like the pictures from the mine disaster. Same clothes, same hairstyles, same innocent faces. But their eyes were all wrong. Too old, too knowing, too hungry. Emma, I said gently. "We've come to take you home." She looked up at me with a smile that broke my heart. "But I am home, Mr. Ranger. My new friends showed me how to play the forever game." "What's the forever game, sweetheart?" "You play and never have to stop, never have to grow up, never have to be alone." She squeezed the hands of the children next to her. "They've been alone for so long, but now they have me. And now they want you too." The child sitting next to Emma, a boy of maybe 12 with coal dust on his face, spoke in a voice too deep for his age. "The mine took us when we were working. The boss man sealed us in to hide his shame. We've been waiting ever since for someone to play with." "Waiting for playmates," added a girl with pigtails. "Forever playmates who won't leave us behind." I reached for Emma, but the moment my hand crossed into their circle, everything changed. The chamber walls began shifting, stretching, rearranging themselves like a living thing. The toys scattered around the floor multiplied until there were hundreds of them, thousands covering every surface. And the children's laughter echoed from all directions at once, layering on top of itself until it became a sound like screaming. My watch, which had read 2:30 p.m. when we entered the mine, now showed 7:45 p.m. 5 hours had passed in what felt like 5 minutes. "Tom," Beth said, her voice strange and distant. "Tom, I remember playing here. I remember this place." I turned to look at her, and for a moment I saw her as a child, 7 years old, pigtails in her hair, playing hopscotch on the chamber floor. Then she was an adult again, but her eyes held the same hungry emptiness as the Hendricks parents. "The forever game," she said dreamily. "We promised to play the forever game." That's when I understood what was happening. The children weren't just trapped in the mine. They were trapped in time, in the moment of their death, replaying the same day over and over for 50 years. And now they were pulling other people into their endless loop. I grabbed Beth's arm and dragged her toward the tunnel entrance. But the passage had changed. Instead of leading back the way we'd come, it curved in a circle, bringing us right back to the playroom chamber. We were trapped, and outside the sun was setting on another search team that would never find us. The truth hit me like a cave-in. We weren't just lost in a mine. We were lost in time itself. The children had been replaying March 15, 1926 for 50 years, and now they were forcing us to join their eternal game. Emma Hendricks looked at me with sad, ancient eyes that didn't belong in an 8-year-old's face. "They're so lonely, Mr. Ranger. They just want friends to play with." "I understand," I said, crouching down to her level. "But your real parents are worried about you. They want you to come home." "These are my real parents now," she pointed to Jim and Sarah Hendricks, still sitting motionless against the wall. "They play the forever game, too. They're children like us, inside their hearts." I looked closer at the adult Hendricks. Their faces had changed, becoming smoother, younger. Jim's beard was gone, and Sarah's gray hairs had turned brown again. They were aging backward, slowly becoming the children they'd once been. "Soon you'll be children too," said the boy with coal dust on his face. I could see now that he was the leader, older than the rest. Everyone becomes children in the end. That's the rule of the forever game. Beth laughed suddenly, a sound like silver bells. When I looked at her, she was skipping in place, her serious ranger training forgotten. "I want to play hopscotch," she said in a voice 20 years younger than her actual age. "Can we play hopscotch?" "Beth, fight it. Remember who you are. Remember your job." But she was already drawing squares on the ground with a piece of coal, humming a nursery rhyme under her breath. The leader child walked over to me. Up close, I could see that his clothes were from the 1920s. Wool knickers, suspenders, a cloth cap. But he moved with the confidence of someone much older. "I'm Timothy Sullivan," he said. "I was the water boy for Shift 3, 14 years old when the boss man sealed us in. I tried to keep the little ones calm while the air ran out." "You don't have to stay here," I told him. "Whatever's keeping you trapped, we can help you break free." "Break free to what? We died 50 years ago. Our families are gone. The world moved on without us." His eyes filled with a sadness deeper than any child should know. This is all we have left, each other and our games. But you're hurting innocent people. We're saving them, don't you see? Out there, children grow up and forget how to play. They become adults with jobs and worries and broken hearts. Here, they stay happy forever. I felt something changing in my own mind. The worries and responsibilities that weighed on me every day seemed silly now, unimportant. What mattered was this wonderful playroom full of toys and friends and endless games. The iron railroad spike in my pocket grew warm against my leg. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Iron keeps bad things away, Tommy. It cuts through lies and shows the truth. I gripped the spike and the fog cleared from my thoughts. The playroom was real, but the happiness wasn't. These children weren't playing. They were trapped in a nightmare of eternal childhood, and they wanted to trap everyone else too. Timothy, I said, what if I told you there was another way? What if you could rest instead of playing forever? Rest is for when you're tired. We're never tired here. But you are tired. I can see it in your eyes. You're exhausted from playing the same games for 50 years. You want to stop, but you're afraid of being alone. For the first time, the boy looked uncertain. Around the chamber, the other children stopped their games and watched us. The mine collapse wasn't your fault, I continued. The company boss who sealed you in, he was the one who did wrong. You were just children trying to help your families. We know that, said the girl with pigtails. But knowing doesn't change anything. We're still dead. We're still forgotten. You're not forgotten. I'll make sure of that. I pulled out my notepad and started writing down their names from the wall. Timothy Sullivan, age 14. Mary Beth Cooper, age 9. Every single one of you. I'll tell the world what really happened here. You'll forget as soon as you leave, Timothy said. Everyone forgets. I won't forget, I promise. Beth was now completely lost in childhood, playing tea party with Emma and 2 other girls. The adult Hendricks were getting younger by the hour, their faces smooth and unlined. Let them go, I said to Timothy. If you want to stay here and play your games, that's your choice. But these people have lives to live. They have children of their own who need them. If we let them go, we'll be alone again. You don't have to be alone. You can move on together. All 47 of you. But you have to choose to stop playing the game. Timothy looked around at his companions. Some of them nodded slowly, understanding dawning in their young faces. Others shook their heads, terrified at the thought of leaving their eternal playground. We've been here so long, whispered Mary Beth. What if there's nothing else? There is, I said, though I had no way of knowing for sure. But you have to trust me. The chamber began to shake. Dust rained from the ceiling as the timbers groaned under impossible weight. The children's time loop was breaking down, and the mine was trying to collapse again, completing the disaster that had trapped them 50 years ago. Choose now, I shouted over the rumbling. Stay and play forever, or trust that there's something better waiting. Timothy Sullivan looked at me with eyes that held 5 decades of loneliness and fear. Then he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Children, he called to the others, time to put away our toys. One by one, they stopped playing. Emma Hendricks blinked and looked around in confusion as her adult mind returned. Beth shook her head and stood up, no longer interested in tea parties. The Hendricks parents aged back to normal, awareness flooding back into their faces. But the mine was collapsing for real now. We had minutes, maybe less. This way, Timothy called, leading us toward a passage I hadn't seen before. The way out is through the old emergency shaft. We ran through tunnels that shifted and changed around us as reality reasserted itself. Behind us, the playroom chamber caved in with a sound like thunder. 50 years of accumulated toys and games disappeared under tons of rock. At the emergency shaft, Timothy and the other children stopped. Sunlight streamed down from above, but they couldn't cross into it. We can't go with you, Mary Beth said. The light is for the living. What will happen to you? We'll find out together, Timothy said. He looked peaceful now, no longer carrying the weight of keeping 46 other children entertained for eternity. One by one, the ghost children faded in the sunlight, but not before each one smiled and waved goodbye. Timothy was the last to go. "Thank you for remembering our names," he said. "That's all we ever wanted, to be remembered." Then he was gone, and we were alone in a real mine shaft with real sunlight above us, and the sound of real rescue teams calling our names. The official report listed the incident as a cave-in rescue with temporary disorientation due to carbon monoxide exposure. The Hendricks family was found suffering from mild hypothermia and memory loss consistent with being trapped in an oxygen-poor environment. Beth Williams was treated for exhaustion and stress-related hallucinations. Nobody mentioned the toys we'd found, because when the rescue teams went back into the mine, there were no toys, just empty chambers carved from coal and 47 names scratched into the walls. The mine was sealed with concrete 3 days later, declared geologically unstable by federal inspectors. The official cause of the 1926 disaster was listed as structural failure due to inadequate safety measures and company negligence in child labor practices. But I know the truth. I kept my promise to Timothy Sullivan and the others. I researched every name on that wall, tracked down descendants, found old newspaper clippings that had buried the real story. The mining company had used child workers in violation of state laws, and when safety inspectors showed up unexpectedly, they'd sealed the children in the deepest tunnels rather than face prosecution. 47 children had died, not from an accident, but from corporate greed and adult cowardice. I used my own money to commission a memorial stone for the victims. It sits now in the Shenandoah Valley Cemetery, listing every name and age exactly as I'd copied them from the mine wall. Sometimes, especially around dawn, people report hearing children's laughter near the memorial. Happy laughter this time. Free laughter. The Hendricks family recovered completely, though Emma sometimes talks about the sad children who just wanted to play. She draws pictures of them occasionally. Always 47 children holding hands in a circle. Jim and Sarah don't remember much about their time in the mine, which is probably for the best. Beth Williams was never quite the same. She transferred to fire prevention work and avoids confined spaces. Sometimes I catch her staring into the distance with a strange expression, like she's listening to music only she can hear. But she's alive and whole, and that's what matters. As for me, I requested a transfer from search and rescue. Couldn't handle missing children cases anymore. Every time I got a call about a lost kid, I'd think about Timothy Sullivan and wonder if there were other places in these mountains where time stood still and children played forever. Because the Devil's Backbone Ridge isn't unique. These mountains are old, older than the mines, older than the settlements. There are things sleeping in the deep hollows that predate human understanding. The coal company just happened to dig into something that should have been left alone. Last month, I got a call about missing hikers near Devil's Backbone. 3 teenagers who'd gone exploring over the weekend and never came home. I told the dispatcher to send someone else, that I was busy with paperwork. But driving home that evening, I passed the memorial stone I'd had erected for the mining victims. Fresh flowers had been placed at the base, wildflowers that don't bloom in October. And carved into the stone beneath the original names, 3 new ones had appeared. Jennifer Adams, age 16, Michael Torres, age 17, Ashley Klein, age 15. The stone was smooth and unmarked when I'd checked it the week before. I sat in my truck for a long time, listening to the wind in the trees and watching shadows move among the headstones. Somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard Beth Williams laughing with a group of children, playing games that never end. Some promises can't be kept, and some children never make it home. If you're ever hiking in old mining country and you hear children playing where no children should be, turn around and walk away. Don't listen to their games or their laughter, or their invitations to play. Some games have rules you can't win, and some friends never let you leave. The Hollow's children are still out there, in places where time forgot to move. Forward, and grief learned to play pretend. They're lonely, and they're always looking for new playmates. And once you join their game, you play forever. My name is William Ashford, but everyone calls me Billy. I've been a ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest for 18 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these Kentucky hills could throw at me. Illegal hunting, drug labs, lost hikers, and more moonshine stills than I could count. Growing up in coal country, the third generation of my family to work these mountains, I figured I knew every secret the forest kept. I was wrong. It was August of 1982, hot enough to fry an egg on a rock. The kind of heat that makes the air thick as soup and turns every shadow into a blessing. I'd been tracking reports of hikers getting sick near Red River Gorge, violent sick in ways that didn't make sense. The water department said their tests came back clean, but something was making people sicker than dogs. That's when I found Devil's Still Hollow. The name wasn't on any map I'd ever seen, but old-timers would whisper about it sometimes. A hidden valley 30 miles from the nearest backup, tucked away in limestone caves and rhododendron thickets so thick you needed a machete to get through. Local Cherokee used to avoid the place, said it was cursed ground where the earth itself had gone sour. I should have listened. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Sweet corn mash mixed with something else, something that made my stomach turn. Then I heard it. The steady drip, drip, drip of a still in operation. Which was impossible because I'd been watching this valley for 3 days straight, and nobody had gone in or out. I radioed dispatch. Base, this is Ranger 47. Found what looks like an active distillery operation in Sector 12, requesting ATF backup. Static crackled back. Copy that, 47. ATF's 2 hours out. Do not engage until backup arrives. But the smell was getting stronger, and somewhere in those rhododendrons, something was cooking that shouldn't be. I'd busted a nut. Stills to know the sound of fresh mash fermenting, and this one was running full blast. I moved closer, staying low, using my camera to document what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the copper tubing snaking through the underbrush. More tubing than any still should need, twisted and coiled like something alive. It gleamed in the dappled sunlight, and for just a second, I could have sworn I saw it pulse. The forest had gone dead quiet. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the leaves. Just that steady dripping and the wet sound of something bubbling in the distance. Even the wind had stopped, like the whole valley was holding its breath. I'd been chasing moonshiners for years, but this felt different. Wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on. The air tasted metallic, and my radio kept picking up interference, not static, but something that sounded almost like music. Old music, like the jazz my grandfather used to play. That should have been my first clue to get out. But I was a ranger, and rangers don't run from illegal stills, no matter how creepy they feel. The still itself sat in a natural clearing surrounded by limestone caves. I'd never seen anything like it. Copper pots the size of bathtubs connected by a maze of tubing that seemed to go on forever, disappearing into cave mouths and emerging from others. Steam rose from multiple boilers, but I couldn't see any fire source. No propane tanks, no wood pile, nothing that should be keeping those pots hot. And the thing was running itself. I watched for an hour through my binoculars. The mash stirred on its own, thick wooden paddles moving in slow circles without any hands to guide them. Liquid flowed through the copper tubing in impossible patterns, sometimes flowing uphill, sometimes splitting into streams that shouldn't exist. I started taking pictures, but my camera kept acting up. The imsum. Ages came out strange, showing figures that weren't there when I looked with my naked eye, shadows that moved wrong. And in one photo, clear as day, I could see the outline of a man in old-fashioned clothes standing next to the biggest still. But when I looked up from the camera, the clearing was empty. My radio crackled to life. Ranger 47, this is Agent Rodriguez, ATF. We're 40 minutes out. What's your status? I've got eyes on the operation, I whispered back. But something's not right here. The equipment's running without operators. Say again? The still's operating itself. I've been watching for over an hour, and there's nobody here. Long pause. Stay back and maintain observation. We're coming in fast. But Agent Rodriguez never made it to the still. I found him 6 hours later, unconscious at the tree line, and when the medics got to him, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Rodriguez was 35 when he'd started hiking in that morning. The man we carried out looked 60. His hair had gone completely white. Deep lines creased his face, and his hands were spotted with age. The doctors said it was impossible. Nobody ages 25 years in 6 hours. They ran every test they could think of, but Rodriguez was healthy, just old, really, really old, and he couldn't remember anything past walking into the valley. That's when I knew we were dealing with something beyond moonshine. The local water tests came back that evening, and they made even less sense. The springs near the still showed pure grain alcohol content, not traces, not contamination, but like someone had been pumping moonshine directly into the groundwater. Water doesn't ferment itself. Water doesn't turn into whiskey without grain and heat and time. But somehow, these springs were running with liquor. I called my partner, Susan McKnight, and filled her in on what I'd found. Susan was smart, tougher than most men I knew, and she'd been a ranger almost as long as I had. If anyone could help me figure out what was happening in Devil's Still Hollow, it was her. "Billy," she said after I finished my report, "you're talking about impossible things. I know how it sounds." "Do you? Because you're telling me there's a ghost still in the mountains that's aging people and turning water into alcohol. I'm telling you something's down there that we don't understand, and it's dangerous." Susan was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm bringing backup and a historian. If something weird's happening in those hills, I want to know what happened there before." While I waited for Susan to arrive, I went back to watch the still. This time I stayed farther back, using field glasses to observe from a safe distance. The operation never stopped. Steam rose constantly from the boilers, the paddles stirred without hands, and liquid flowed through that maze of copper tubing like blood through veins. But now I could see more. The plants around the still were growing in patterns that shouldn't exist. Corn stalks twisted into spirals, fruit trees bearing apples and pears and cherries all on the same branches. The grass itself seemed to move with purpose, reaching toward the copper pots like it was thirsty for whatever was cooking inside. And the smell was getting stronger. Sweet mash and copper and something else. Something rotten underneath it all, like meat left too long in the sun. As the sun set, I saw lights in the caves. Not electric lights, but the warm glow of oil lamps. And with the lights came sounds. Footsteps, the clink of glass, and voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. But when I looked closer, the caves were empty. Susan arrived the next morning with 3 backup rangers and Dr. Patricia Howells, a historian from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Howells had brought boxes of research about the area, and what she told us made my blood run cold. "This valley has a history," she said, spreading out old maps and newspaper clippings. In 1925, a master distiller named Jeremiah Crowder was running the biggest moonshine operation in eastern Kentucky right here in Devil's Still Hollow. The feds finally tracked him down, but when they moved in, something went wrong. She showed us a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Revenue agents kill bootlegger in raid gone bad." The article was short, but the details were clear. Jeremiah Crowder had been shot down next to his still, his body falling into one of the mash vats. But when the agents went to retrieve the body, it was gone. They searched for days, but never found any trace of him. "The agents sealed the caves and left," Dr. Howells continued. "But locals started reporting strange things. Sounds of distilling at night, the smell of cooking mash, springs running with alcohol. After a few years, people just started avoiding the valley altogether." "You're saying this Crowder is still down there?" Susan asked. "I'm saying the locals have believed so for 57 years. We decided to investigate as a group, safety in numbers and all that. But as we hiked into Devil's Still Hollow, our equipment started acting up. Radios filled with static and what sounded like 1920s jazz music. Our metal detectors went crazy, showing massive metallic signatures everywhere we pointed them, and our cameras kept taking pictures on their own. The still was larger than I'd realized. What I'd thought was one operation was actually a whole network of connected distilleries with copper tubing running in and out of caves like a circulatory system. Some of the caves were so deep we couldn't see the back walls, but we could hear machinery humming in the darkness. This is incredible, Dr. Howells whispered, examining the craftsmanship of the copperwork. This is all hand-forged, probably from the 1920s. It should have corroded decades ago, but it looks almost new. That's when we found the first body. Deep in the largest cave, arranged around a copper cauldron the size of a hot tub, were skeletal remains in rotted clothing. 1920s clothing, suspenders, wool trouse, Ayres button-up boots. The bones were positioned like they'd been sitting around the cauldron when they died, and the cauldron itself was full of a liquid that glowed with its own light. Jesus, Susan breathed. How many people died down here? As we got closer, I counted at least 12 skeletons, all dressed in period clothing, all arranged in a circle around that glowing cauldron. And the liquid inside was bubbling and steaming even though there was no heat source underneath. That's when we heard the voice. "Been waiting for you boys to come back." We spun around, weapons drawn, but the cave was empty. Just us and the bones and that impossible glowing liquid. "Took you long enough," the voice continued, and now I could tell it was coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the bubbling cauldron itself. Thought those revenue boys might have given up after all these years. One of the backup rangers, a young guy named Peters, started backing toward the cave entrance. But when he reached what should have been the opening, he hit solid rock. The way out had vanished. Now, the voice said, and it was amused. "Y'all came to shut down my operation. Least you can do is stay for a taste." The cauldron bubbled harder and steam began filling the cave. But this wasn't normal steam. It was thick and golden, and when I breathed it in, I felt dizzy. Drunk, even though I hadn't touched a drop of alcohol. "Susan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to get out of here." But Susan was staring at the cauldron with a strange expression on her face. "Billy," she said slowly, "look at my hands." I looked. Her hands were younger than they'd been that morning. The lines around her knuckles had faded, and the small scar on her palm from a childhood accident was gone. "It's the steam," Dr. Howells said, her voice full of wonder and terror. "It's reversing. The aging process." "Temporary side effect," the voice said, and now I could see a shape forming in the steam, a tall, gaunt man in 1920s clothing. "The real recipe takes more than steam. The real recipe takes essence." The figure solidified, and I found myself looking at Jeremiah Crowder. He was translucent, but solid enough that I could see the bullet holes in his chest and the fury in his eyes. 57 years I've been perfecting my formula," he said. "Liquid immortality. But it needs a key ingredient, and that ingredient walks on two legs." Crowder gestured to the skeletons around the cauldron. "They volunteered in a way. Hikers mostly, campers. Revenue agents who got too close. Each one added their life essence to the recipe, and each batch got me closer to perfection." Susan was still changing. Her hair was darker now, the gray streaks disappearing, and her face was smoothing out like someone was erasing years with an invisible hand. "Stop it," I demanded. "Whatever you're doing to her, stop it." "Can't stop the process once it starts," Crowder said with a grin that showed too many teeth. "She breathed the vapor, and now she's part of the recipe. But don't worry. In a few hours, she'll be young enough to start over. Of course, she won't remember being an adult, won't remember you or her job or anything past about age 10. Susan was looking around the cave with increasing confusion, like she was seeing it for the first time. When she looked at me, there was no recognition in her eyes. "The beauty of my operation," Crowder continued, "is that it runs itself now. Been running since 1925, getting stronger every year. Every soul that goes into the mix makes the recipe more powerful, and every batch I make grants true immortality to whoever drinks it." He held up a mason jar filled with the same glowing liquid from the cauldron. "One sip, and you'll never age another day. Never get sick, never die. All I ask in return is that you help me keep the still supplied with raw materials." "You mean people," Dr. Howells said. "Life essence," Crowder chorused. "Kiddo, the most important ingredient in any immortality recipe." The other rangers were starting to panic. Peters was clawing at the cave wall where the entrance used to be, and the other two were backing away from Crowder with their weapons drawn. Not that bullets would do much good against a ghost. "Here's my offer," Crowder said, his voice echoing off the cave walls. "One of you drinks the moonshine and becomes my partner. Helps me harvest the life essence I need to keep the operation running. In exchange, that person gets eternal life and all the perfect liquor they can drink." He looked directly at me. "You're a moonshine man, aren't you, Billy? Third-generation mountain family. Your granddaddy probably made shine himself during Prohibition." He was right, and somehow he knew it. Granddaddy Ashford had run a small still up on Cedar Ridge until the revenuers shut him down in 1928. "You understand the craft," Crowder continued. "You respect the tradition. You'd make a fine partner." Susan was getting younger by the minute. She looked like she was in her 20s now, and her eyes held the innocent confusion of someone who didn't understand where she was or why these men were pointing guns at a ghost. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Crowder shrugged. "Then you all become ingredients. Your life essence gets added to the next batch, and I wait for the next group of visitors to come investigate the strange disappearances." The still was getting louder now, the bubbling and steaming more intense. I could feel the heat from the copper pots, even though we were deep in the cave, and the air was so thick with alcoholic vapor that I was having trouble thinking straight. But I noticed something Crowder might not have realized. The cauldron with the glowing liquid was connected to the rest of the still by a single copper pipe, and next to the cauldron was a natural spring, Water B, bubbling up from deep in the limestone. Water, running water. I remembered what the Cherokee had said about spirits and running water, how it disrupted supernatural manifestations, broke the connection between the spirit world and ours. "I'll do it," I said suddenly. "I'll drink your moonshine and be your partner." Susan, who now looked like a teenager, made a small sound of protest, but she couldn't form the words to object. Crowder's eyes lit up with triumph. "Smart choice, Billy. You won't regret this." He handed me the mason jar full of glowing liquid. It was warm to the touch and smelled like corn mash and copper and something else I couldn't identify. Something that made every instinct I had scream in warning. "Just one sip to seal the deal," Crowder said. "Then we can discuss the details of our partnership." I raised the jar to my lips, but instead of drinking, I threw the entire contents into the natural spring. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The glowing liquid hit the running water and dissolved like sugar, spreading in golden streaks that quickly faded to nothing. Crowder screamed, a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe, and his form flickered like a candle in the wind. "What have you done?" he roared. "Diluted your recipe," I said, and dove for the copper pipe connecting the cauldron to the main still. The pipe tore free, easier than it should have, and instantly the entire cave system started shaking. The cauldron's glow faded, the impossible steam stopped rising, and Crowder's form began to waver. "You've ruined everything," he shrieked. 57 years of work." But even as he raged, I could see he was fading. The running water had broken whatever supernatural force was keeping him anchored to the physical world, and destroying the connection between his special moonshine and the main still had severed his power source. "The mountain spirits were right," I told him as the cave walls began to crack. "Some recipes should never be completed." Susan was aging back to normal as the supernatural influence faded, her adult memories returning in confused fragments. The other rangers were helping her toward where the cave entrance had reappeared, and Dr. Howells was gathering her research materials. Crowder made one last, desperate attempt to stop us, lunging forward with hands that were more shadow than substance, but he passed right through me, and with a final wail of frustration and loss, he faded completely. The entire cave system collapsed 30 seconds after we made it outside. When the dust settled, Devil's Still Hollow looked like it had been hit by an earthquake. The limestone caves had caved in, the copper tubing was buried under tons of rock, and the springs ran clear for the first time in decades. The official report blamed the collapse on natural limestone erosion. The ATF investigation found evidence of a sophisticated illegal distillery operation, but no operator, which they classified as a remote-controlled still using unknown technology. Agent Rodriguez recovered fully but never remembered anything about his rapid aging incident. As for me, something changed that day in the cave. I can't drink alcohol anymore. Even a sip of beer makes me violently ill. My hair went completely gray within a month, and I developed a sensitivity to distilleries that I can't explain. I can smell an active still from miles away, and the scent makes my stomach turn. I transferred to fire prevention after that, couldn't handle investigating alcohol-related crimes anymore. But I keep monitoring reports of strange incidents in old bootlegger territory throughout Appalachian country, and I'm not the only one who's had encounters with supernatural stills. Last week I found 3 mason jars on my doorstep. Fresh moonshine, clear as crystal, and smooth as silk. Nobody in these mountains makes shine like that anymore. Inside each jar was a note written in old-fashioned handwriting. Thanks for the less. On, partner. Next time, bring your own recipe. They were signed J. Crowder. The thing about mountain spirits is they're harder to kill than you might think. And Jeremiah Crowder spent 57 years learning how to make the impossible possible. If you're planning to explore old bootlegger country, take my advice. If you smell mash cooking where there shouldn't be anyone, don't investigate. Some operations have been running longer than they should, and their recipes call for ingredients you can't afford to give. The mountains remember everything, every still, every murder, every secret buried in limestone caves. And sometimes, the dead keep working long after they should have quit. Because there's always another batch to brew, and there's always someone new willing to taste what's cooking in the hollow. My name is Bobby Coleridge, and I spent 16 years making old mines safe for folks who wanted to explore them. Used to be a coal miner myself, just like my daddy before me. But after Daddy died in a cave-in back in '63, I switched sides. Started working for the Forest Service instead, making sure nobody else would get hurt in those dark holes underground. I thought I knew every danger a mine could throw at you. Bad air that could knock you out cold. Walls that could come down without warning. Water that could fill up a tunnel faster than you could run. After all those years, I figured I'd seen it all. I was wrong. It was November of '79 when the EPA called me up about Black Rock Mine. They wanted to turn the old place into some kind of tourist cave, maybe put in some lights and walkways so families could see what mining used to be like. My job was simple. Go down there, check if it was safe, write up a report. Black Rock had been shut down since '63, same year Daddy died. Different mine, but same story. Company pushed too hard, ignored the warning signs, and people got hurt. 73 miners died in an explosion back in '43, but they reopened it anyway. Money talks louder than safety, always has. The mine sat about 35 miles from the nearest town, way up in the mountains where the old access roads had grown over with weeds and young trees. I had to hike the last 2 miles with my equipment, breathing hard in the cold November air. The entrance looked like a giant mouth cut into the hillside with rusty metal doors hanging off their hinges. I set up my testing equipment outside first, the way we always did. Air quality monitor, methane detector, radio for emergencies. Everything checked out normal. The mountain was quiet except for the wind through the bare trees and the crunch of frost under my boots. But something felt off right from the start. Can't explain it exactly. Just a feeling in my gut that this place wasn't as dead as it should be. The air coming out of the mine entrance felt warm, like there was still heat somewhere deep inside. And there was this smell, faint but unmistakable, fresh coal dust. That should have been impossible. Mine had been closed for 16 years. Any coal dust should have settled long ago, or been washed away by rain and groundwater. But I could taste it in the air, gritty on my tongue despite the breathing mask I wore. I clipped my safety line to the entrance frame and clicked on my headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, showing old wooden support beams and rusty rail tracks disappearing into the black. My footsteps echoed weird in the tunnel, like the sound was bouncing off walls that weren't there. 20 feet in, I found the first thing that made me stop and think. A coal cart, sitting on the tracks like someone had just filled it up. The coal looked fresh, black and shiny without the gray coating that comes with age. I picked up a piece. It was still warm. I told myself there had to be a reason. Maybe some illegal mining operation, though I couldn't figure out how they'd get equipment in here without leaving tracks. Maybe natural heating from deep underground, though that didn't explain why the coal looked so fresh. But as I went deeper into the mine, checking air quality and mapping the tunnels on my clipboard, I kept finding more things that didn't make sense. Conveyor belts that should have been rusted solid, but looked like they'd been running yesterday. Electric lights that flickered when there was no power coming to the mine. Tools left lying around like the workers had just gone to lunch and would be back any minute. The deeper I went, the warmer it got. My breath stopped fogging up and I had to unzip my jacket. The air readings on my equipment kept jumping around. Oxygen would drop, then spike back up, like something was breathing in the tunnels ahead of me. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, easy to mistake for wind or settling rock. But I knew the sound too well from my mining days. The rhythmic chunk, chunk, chunk of pickaxes hitting coal, the rumble of cartwheels on metal tracks, the distant shouts of men calling to each other in the darkness. Impossible, but I heard it. I followed the sounds deeper into the mine, my heart beating faster with each step. The tunnel split into 3 directions, and I had to choose which way to go. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls in ways that made no sense. I chose the middle tunnel and walked for what felt like hours, though my watch said only 20 minutes had passed. The sounds got louder. Definitely voices now, definitely men working. I could make out individual words sometimes, shouted instructions about moving coal and checking for gas. But every time I thought I was getting close, the sounds would fade away, like the workers had knocked off for the day and gone home. Except there was nowhere for them to go. Only one way in and out of Black Rock Mine, and I'd come through it. By the time I made it back to the surface, the sun was setting behind the mountains. I packed up my equipment with shaking hands, telling myself I'd just been down there too long. Bad air can make you hear things that aren't there. Stress can play tricks on your mind. But that night in my motel room, I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds, about the fresh coal and the warm air and the feeling that something was watching me in those tunnels. I called my supervisor and told him I needed another day to finish the survey. He wasn't happy about the overtime, but he agreed. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already made up my mind. Whatever was happening in Black Rock Mine, I was going to figure it out, even if part of me was starting to think I might not like what I found. I went back to Black Rock the next morning with more equipment and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Funny choice of words, looking back on it now. This time I brought Patricia Owens with me. Patty was a mining engineer, smart as a whip and twice as tough. She'd been wanting to see the old mine anyway, said it would help her understand the geology of the area. I figured having someone else there would either prove I was hearing things or prove I wasn't. Either way, I'd have an answer. Patty took one look at the mine entrance and whistled low. They really built these old ones to last, didn't they? Look at that timber work. Fresh coal dust, I said, pointing to the black powder coating everything near the entrance. Been closed 16 years, but there's fresh dust everywhere. She bent down and rubbed some between her fingers. That is weird. Should be all weathered gray by now. She looked up at me with those sharp eyes of hers. You think someone's been mining here illegally? That's what I want to find out. We went in together this time, both of us wearing full safety gear and carrying radio equipment. I led the way, retracing my path from the day before. But something was different. The tunnels looked the same, but they felt more alive somehow, like the mountain was waking up. We found the first impossible thing about 50 feet in, a time card punch station, the old-fashioned kind with a big mechanical clock and slots for worker cards. The clock was running, ticking away the seconds with a sound like a heartbeat in the dark. That's not possible, Patty said, checking her instruments. No electrical power down here. Battery on that thing should have died years ago. I walked over to look at the time cards. There were dozens of them, all yellowed with age, but somehow still readable. Names I recognized from the 1943 disaster: James Morrison, William Creek, Thomas Blackwood. All dead men, according to the records. But Todd, he cards showed recent punch-ins. Yesterday's date. Some from early this morning, before Patty and I had even arrived. Look at this, I called her over. These cards are being used. Patty studied them with her engineer's eye for detail. The handwriting looks old-fashioned. See how they make their sevens? That's how my grandfather used to write. She pulled out a magnifying glass. But this ink is fresh. I can smell it. We kept walking, following the main tunnel deeper into the mine. The sounds started again about 10 minutes later. Distant at first, then getting clearer. Men working, tools on rock, the creak and groan of wooden supports under pressure. You hear that? I asked. Patty stopped walking and tilted her head. Yeah. It sounds like mining. Active mining. That's what I heard yesterday. We followed the sounds, moving carefully through passages that hadn't seen maintenance in 16 years. But the deeper we went, the better condition everything was in. Support beams looked solid, rail tracks were clear of debris, even the air tasted cleaner, like someone was running ventilation fans. Then we found the working face. It was a large chamber where miners had been cutting coal from the seam, taking it out chunk by chunk until they'd carved out a room big enough to drive a truck through. Only problem was, according to my maps, this chamber had been exhausted and sealed back in 1962. Should have been full of rubble and cave-in debris. Instead, it was active. Fresh coal everywhere, piled in neat stacks like someone had just finished a shift. Tools laid out in organized rows. Even a lunch pail sitting on a wooden crate, like a worker had just stepped away for a smoke break. This doesn't make sense, Patty said, checking her maps against what we were seeing. This seam was mined out 20 years ago. I picked up one of the tools, a coal pick with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. It was warm to the touch, and I could swear I felt it vibrate slightly, like it was eager to get back to work. That's when we heard the view. Oases. Not distant echoes this time, but clear conversation coming from somewhere nearby. Two men talking about the day's quota and how much coal they needed to move before the shift boss came around. Did you hear that? Patty whispered. I nodded, trying to figure out which direction the voices were coming from. Sound bounces weird in mine tunnels, but these seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. We followed a side passage toward the voices, our headlamps cutting through air that was getting thicker with coal dust, despite all our safety equipment. The voices got clearer, close enough that we should have been able to see who was talking, but the tunnel ahead of us was empty. Hello? I called out. Anyone there? The voices stopped instantly, like someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was so complete it hurt my ears. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the coal dust floating in the air. We kept walking until we reached another chamber, this one even bigger than the last. And that's where we found them. Coal carts lined up in neat rows, each one filled to the brim with fresh coal. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching back into the darkness beyond our lights. Someone had been very busy down here. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the shift supervisor's office. It was built into an alcove in the chamber wall, with glass windows and a wooden door that looked like it had been painted yesterday. Through the windows we could see a desk with papers scattered on top, a calendar on the wall, even a coffee cup with steam rising from it. The calendar showed November 1979. Today's date. Okay, Patty said, her voice tight with confusion. Now I'm officially freaked out. I tried the door handle. It turned easily, and the door swung open with a small squeak from hinges that should have been rusted solid. The office as warm and dry, lit by an electric bulb hanging from the ceiling. Impossible, but there it was. On the desk were production reports, all written in the same old-fashioned handwriting we'd seen on the time cards. Daily coal output numbers, worker assignments, safety inspection notes, all dated within the last month, but the workers listed were all dead, had been dead for 36 years. I picked up the most recent report, dated that morning. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, someone had written, "Quota not met. Shift to continue until production goals achieved. Supervisor Morrison, James Morrison." The same name from the 1943 disaster records, the shift supervisor who'd died in the explosion. That's when the lights went out. Not just our headlamps, those were still working fine, but the electric bulb in the office flickered and died, along with every other light we'd seen working in the mine. The darkness was so complete it felt solid, pressing against us from all sides. And in that darkness, we heard something that made my blood turn to ice water. Footsteps. Heavy work boots on rock and metal coming closer. Not just one person, but many. A whole crew of workers, walking with the tired, steady rhythm of men at the end of a long shift. They were coming our way. "We need to get out of here," Patty whispered. I couldn't have agreed more. We ran through those tunnels faster than we'd ever moved underground, following our safety line back toward the entrance. Behind us, the footsteps kept pace, never catching up but never falling behind either. We didn't stop running until we reached daylight, and even then, standing outside the mine entrance with the November sun on our faces, we could still hear those footsteps echoing from the darkness below. We should have left then. Should have packed up our equipment and driven back to town and told the EPA that Black Rock Mine was too dangerous for tourists. But we didn't. Maybe it was professional curiosity. Maybe it was plain old stubbornness. Or maybe something in that mine was already getting its hooks into use. Patty wanted to go back in with recording equipment. Said we needed proof of what we'd seen, something to show our supervisors. I thought it was a bad idea, but I couldn't let her go alone. So the next morning, we came back with cameras and sound recorders and enough battery power to light up a small town. The mine was different again. The entrance looked older somehow, more worn down. Rust that hadn't been there before covered the metal supports, and the air coming out was colder, carrying the smell of deep earth and old death. But we went in anyway. This time we found the mine running at full capacity. Conveyor belts moving coal from deep chambers to loading areas near the entrance, pumps working to keep water out of the lower tunnels, electric lights strung along the ceiling, powered by cables that led nowhere. And workers. We could see them now, shadowy figures moving in the distance, always just at the edge of our lights. Men in old-fashioned mining clothes, pushing coal carts and working with tools that should have been in a museum. "Are you getting this on camera?" I asked Patty. She checked her equipment. "The camera's working, but look at this." The view screen showed the tunnel ahead of us, but empty. No workers, no moving equipment, no lights. Just an abandoned mine shaft full of rust and debris. "That's impossible," I said. "I can see them right there." "I can see them too, but the camera can't." We kept recording anyway, following the sounds of work deeper into the mine. The phantom miners seemed to be everywhere now, their voices echoing from every tunnel. Conversations about quotas and safety inspections and how much coal they needed to move before the end of shift. In one of the deeper chambers, we found something that made us both stop cold. A mining machine, one of those big mechanical cutters they use to slice coal from the seam. It was runny, chewing through solid rock with a sound like thunder, cutting fresh coal and loading it onto conveyor belts. The machine was from 1943. I knew because I'd seen pictures in the disaster. Reports. Same make, same model, same serial number. It had been destroyed in the explosion that killed 73 men, but here it was, working like new. "This is getting crazy," Patty said, but she didn't sound scared anymore. She sounded excited. "Do you see how efficient this operation is? They're moving 3 times more coal than any modern mine could handle." I looked at her, worried by the gleam in her eyes. "Patty, these aren't real workers. You know that, right?" "Maybe not real in the way we understand it," she said, "but look at what they're accomplishing. Look at the production numbers." She pulled out the shift reports we'd found the day before, studying them with the intensity of an engineer seeing a perfect machine. "They're running 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. No breaks, no sick days, no safety delays. It's incredible. It's also impossible." But Patty wasn't listening anymore. She was walking toward the mining machine, drawn by its thunderous efficiency. I grabbed her arm to stop her and felt something that scared me more than anything we'd seen yet. Her skin was cold. Not just cool from the mine air, but actually cold. Like she'd been underground for days instead of hours. And when I looked at her hands, I could see black lines under her fingernails. Coal dust, but not the kind that washes off. "Patty, we need to get out of here. Now." She shook her head. "Not yet. I want to see how they manage the lower tunnels. The engineering here is amazing." That's when I realized the mine was changing her. The same way it had changed the workers back in 1943, pushing them to work longer and harder and faster until they couldn't stop, until the mountain itself became their master. I tried to drag her toward the exit, but she was stronger than she should have been. The coal dust in her system was doing something to her, making her part of the mine's endless hunger for production. "The quota," she said, her voice taking on the same rhythms as the phantom workers. "We have to meet the quota." Behind us, the sounds of mining were getting louder. More workers joining the shift, their voices blending together into a chorus of industrial determination. And somewhere in that chorus, I heard a new voice. Patricia Owens, calling out production numbers and efficiency reports. Her voice already starting to echo like the others. I ran. Not proud of it, but I ran for the surface as fast as my legs could carry me. Behind me, the mine kept working, its hunger fed by another victim. The sounds followed me all the way to the entrance. Machines and voices and the endless rhythm of work that never stops. When I reached daylight, I turned back to look at the mine entrance. For just a moment, I could see them all clearly. Dozens of workers in the darkness, their faces pale and their eyes black with coal dust. And standing among them, already wearing the same old-fashioned mining clothes, was Patty. She looked up at me and smiled, but it wasn't her smile anymore. It was the satisfied expression of someone who'd finally found their life's work. "The shift's not over," she called out, her voice echoing from the depths. "We still have quota to meet." Then the darkness swallowed her up, and I was alone outside the mine with the November wind and the growing certainty that I was running out of time to save her. That night, I called every expert I could think of. Mining historians, safety engineers, even a professor who studied industrial folklore. Most of them thought I was crazy, but a few had heard stories. Mines where workers had died but somehow kept working. Production that continued long after the last human shift had ended. Industrial ghosts, one old-timer called them. Spirits trapped by the work itself, doomed to key, kept producing until someone sets them free. "How do you set them free?" I asked. "You don't," he said. "You seal the mine and hope they rest eventually." But I couldn't seal the mine. Not with Patty still down there, still part of whatever was driving the endless production. I had to go back. Had to find a way to break the cycle that had trapped 73 men in 1943 and was now claiming one more victim. The mine was waiting for me, and deep in my bones, I could feel it calling me back to work. I went back to Black Rock at dawn, carrying everything I thought might help. Holy water from 3 different churches. Salt for making protective circles. A miner's safety lamp that had belonged to my grandfather. And something else. The original disaster reports from 1943, including testimony from the only survivor. His name was Pete Kowalski, and he'd been working the surface that day when the explosion happened. According to his statement, the company had been pushing the miners to work faster, ignoring safety protocols to meet wartime production quotas. They'd detected dangerous methane levels but kept working anyway. The explosion killed 73 men instantly, but Kowalski swore he could still hear them working afterward, their voices echoing from the sealed tunnels, calling out that they hadn't finished their shift. Reading those reports, I finally understood what was happening at Black Rock. The miners hadn't just died in that explosion. They'd been trapped by their work, their dedication to meeting impossible quotas twisted into something that wouldn't let them rest. And now they were recruiting new workers to help them finish a job that could never be completed. The mine entrance was different again when I arrived, busier. I could see lights moving in the depths, hear the constant noise of full-scale mining operations. The mountain itself seemed to be vibrating with activity. I clipped on my safety line and went in, following the sounds deeper than I'd ever gone before. Past the chambers where we'd seen the phantom workers, past the impossible machinery, down into the heart of the mountain where the original coal seam lay. The heat was incredible down there, like walking into a furnace. My safety equipment kept triggering warnings about dangerous gases. but I pressed on. Somewhere in this maze of tunnels, Patty was working alongside 73 dead men, and I was the only one who could bring her back. I found them in the deepest chamber, a vast cavern carved from solid coal. Hundreds of workers now, all moving with the mechanical precision of men who'd been doing the same job for decades. And at the center of it all, standing behind a supervisor's desk that glowed with its own strange light, was the figure I'd been dreading to see. James Morrison, the shift supervisor from 1943. He looked exactly like his ID photo from the disaster reports, except for his eyes. They were black as coal, reflecting the underground lights like polished stone. When he saw me, he smiled with genuine pleasure. "Another worker," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the noise of the machines. "Good. We're behind quota again." "I'm not here to work," I said. "I'm here for Patricia Owens." Morrison consulted a clipboard that seemed to be made of the same glowing material as his desk. "Miss Owens is performing excellently. Production efficiency up 30% since she joined the team. She's management material." I looked around the chamber until I spotted Patty. She was operating a massive coal-cutting machine, her movements smooth and practiced like she'd been doing it for years. But her skin had the same pale, bloodless look as the other workers, and her eyes had started to turn black. "Patty," I called out, "it's time to go." She looked up at me with confusion, like she was having trouble remembering who I was. "Can't leave now," she said. "Shift's not over. We haven't met quota." "There is no quota," I shouted over the noise. "You're all dead. The mine's been closed for 16 years. Morrison laughed, a sound like rocks falling down a shaft. "Dead? Look around you, Mr. Coleridge. Does this look dead to you? We're more productive than we've ever been, more efficient, more dedicated. Death freed us from the weaknesses of the flesh. Now we can work as we were meant to work." That's when I understood the true horror of Black Rock Mine. The explosion in 1943 hadn't killed the workers. It had perfected them, turned them into the ideal labor force that every company dreams of. Workers who never get tired, never complain, never ask for better conditions or higher pay. Workers who exist only to produce. "The company did this to you," I said. "They knew the mine was dangerous, but they made you work anyway. You don't owe them anything." "The company?" Morrison tilted his head like he was trying to remember something from a long time ago. "Oh yes, the company. They understood what we're for, what we were always for." He gestured around the chamber, where dozens of workers continued their eternal shift. "This is perfection, Mr. Coleridge. Pure purpose. No distractions, no desires except to work and produce and meet the quota. Join us, and you'll understand." The workers were closing in now, surrounding me with their pale faces and black eyes. I could see the invitation in their expressions, the promise of endless purpose and meaning. All I had to do was pick up a tool and start working, and I'd never have to worry about anything else again. For a moment, I was tempted. After all the years of struggling with bureaucracy and safety regulations, and the knowledge that good people died because companies cared more about profits than lives, the idea of simple, pure work was almost appealing. But then I looked at Patty again, saw what the mine had taken from her, her curiosity, her independence, her human warmth, everything that made her who she was, sacrificed to feed the mine's hunger for production. "No," I said, "the shift is over." I pulled out the miner's safety lamp, the one there, that had belonged to my grandfather. It was old-fashioned, the kind that burned carbide gas and had to be lit by hand. But it represented something these phantom workers had forgotten, the old ways when miners looked out for each other instead of just serving the company. The flame caught on the first try, burning clean and bright in the methane-heavy air. The workers stepped back, shielding their eyes like the light hurt them. "End a shift," I called out, using the traditional words my grandfather had taught me. "Tools down! All workers to the surface!" Morrison snarled, his face changing into something that wasn't human anymore. "You don't have the authority. I'm the supervisor here." "Not anymore," I said, and pulled out the disaster reports. James Morrison died November 15th, 1943, along with 72 other men. The shift ended 36 years ago. Time to clock out. I started reading the names of the dead, each one listed in the official report. As I spoke, the workers began to stop their machines, setting down their tools with the slow, confused movements of people waking up from a long dream. Thomas Blackwood, William Creek, Samuel Harrison. The lights began to flicker and dim. The endless noise of machinery was slowing down, grinding to a halt for the first time in decades. Frank Morrison, David Walsh, James Morrison. The supervisor let out a roar of rage and despair, his form beginning to fade like smoke in the wind. "The quota," he screamed. "We never finished the quota." "The quota was a lie," I said. "It was always a lie. You died for nothing, and you've been working for nothing ever since. It's time to rest." One by one, the phantom workers began to disappear, their forms dissolving into coal dust that drifted away on a wind that came from nowhere. 73 men finally clocking out after 36 years of overtime. The last to go was Morrison himself, his face twisting with the agony of a man realizing he'd wasted decades on meaningless work. But the company, the production goals, the company's been dead longer than you have, I told him. It's over. And then he was gone, and the mine was truly dead at last. Patty collapsed as the supernatural energy drained out of her, her skin returning to normal color as the coal dust faded from her system. I helped her to her feet, and together we stumbled through the darkened tunnels toward the surface. Behind us, the mountain groaned and shifted as support beams that had been held up by willpower alone finally gave way. The mine was collapsing, sealing itself forever. We made it out just as the entrance caved in, trapping the ghosts of Black Rock Mine under tons of rock and earth. In the sudden silence that followed, I could almost hear the sound of 73 men finally laying down their tools and going home. That was 45 years ago, and I've never been underground since. The EPA listed Black Rock Mine as geologically unstable and sealed the site permanently. Officially, the cave-in was blamed on age and weather damage. The strange production reports and impossible machinery were never mentioned in any government document. Patty recovered, mostly. She went back to engineering work, but she never talked about what happened in the mine. Sometimes I'd catch her staring off into space with a distant look in her eyes, and I knew she was remembering the seductive simplicity of having just one purpose in life. She died 10 years ago. Black lung disease, the doctor said, though she'd only been exposed to coal dust for a few hours in her entire life. At the funeral, her daughter asked me how someone could get black lung from such short exposure. I didn't have an answer she'd want to hear. As for me, I spent the rest of my career working above ground, making sure old mines stayed closed and forgotten. But I kept hearing stories, other sites where equipment ran without power, where the sounds of work echoed from empty tunnels, where FEDI inspectors went in and came out changed. The mountains remember everything. Every drop of blood spilled for coal, every life lost for profit. And sometimes, when companies push hard enough and care little enough about the people who do the actual work, the mountains push back. I retired to a small house about 100 miles from Black Rock, far enough away that I can't hear the mountain calling on quiet nights. But distance doesn't always help. Last month I found a chunk of coal on my doorstep with a note tucked underneath. The note was written in the same old-fashioned handwriting I'd seen on those production reports back in '79. It said, "Shift supervisor says quota still not met. Report for duty Monday morning." It was signed with a name I recognized from the 1943 disaster records, a man who'd been dead for 80 years. I threw the coal into the woods behind my house and burned the note in my fireplace. But every morning since then, I've checked my doorstep, and every morning there's been another piece of coal waiting for me. They're getting bigger. If you're ever driving through the mountains of Virginia and you see old mine entrances, keep going. Don't stop to explore. Don't try to peek inside. And especially don't listen if you hear the sounds of work coming from places where no work should be happening. Some shifts never end. Some quotas are never met. And some companies keep demanding productivity long after everyone involved is dead and buried. The mine is sealed, but the work goes on. It always goes on. And lately, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear Morrison's voice echoing from the mountains, calling for workers to report for the next shift. The quota's still not met, you see. It never will be. My name is Matt Holiness, and I've spent 13 years protecting historic sites in the Cherokee National Forest. People always laugh at my last name when I tell them what happened at Serpent's Holiness Church. They think it's some kind of joke. I wish it was. I'm not a religious man, never have been. Started seminary school once, but dropped out after 2 weeks. Couldn't stomach all that talk about miracles and divine intervention. Give me facts, evidence, things I can touch and measure. That's why I loved my job, preserving real history, keeping vandals away from places that actually mattered. September 1984 was when everything changed. The leaves were just starting to turn in the Unicoi Mountains, and snake season was hitting its peak before they went underground for winter. I'd been getting reports about strange activity at an old Pentecostal church deep in a mountain valley, about 25 miles from the nearest town. The church had been abandoned since 1967, when the last pastor died from a snake bite during Sunday service. Yeah, they were one of those congregations, the ones who believed handling venomous snakes proved your faith. State health departments shut them down after too many people died, but the building still stood there, rotting away in the woods. My job was simple. Check for structural damage, document any vandalism, make sure hikers weren't using it as a party spot. Standard stuff. I'd done dozens of these inspections over the years. Old churches, forgotten cemeteries, abandoned homesteads. They all had the same feel. Sad, maybe, but harmless. The drive up the mountain took 2 hours on roads that barely deserved the name. When I finally reached the valley, I understood why the congregation had built their church here. The place felt separate, cut off from the world. Pine trees rose up on all sides like cathedral walls, and the only sound was rios in through the branches. The church itself was smaller than I'd expected. White clapboard siding, bell tower that leaned slightly to the left, windows covered with old boards. What surprised me was how well preserved it looked. After 17 years of mountain weather, I'd expected total decay. Instead, the roof was intact, the walls were straight, and someone had even kept the weeds from completely taking over. I parked my truck and grabbed my clipboard. Standard inspection protocol. Exterior first, then interior if the building was safe to enter. The front steps creaked under my boots, but they held. The door was unlocked. Another surprise. Most abandoned buildings around here got chained shut or boarded up. The inside made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. Wooden pews still lined up in neat rows, facing a simple altar with a cross hanging above it. Everything was dusty but organized, like the congregation had just stepped out for lunch and might come back any minute. What really got to me was the silence. Not the normal quiet of an empty building, but something deeper, like the air itself was holding its breath. I've been in plenty of abandoned places, and they all have their own sounds: settling wood, wind through cracks, mice in the walls. This place had nothing. Even my footsteps seemed muffled. I spent an hour documenting everything with my camera. The old piano in the corner, sheet music still open to Amazing Grace. The collection plates on a table by the door, dusty but clean. A guest registry book on a wooden stand. The last entry dated September 15th, 1967, the day the pastor died. By the time I finished, the sun was getting low. Mountain valleys get dark fast, and I didn't want to navigate those roads at night. I locked up and headed back to my truck, already planning my report. Structure sound, no vandalism, recommend periodic monitoring. Simple, clean. Just another old building slowly returning to the earth. I should have known better. In my line of work, the quiet places are usually the most dangerous. 3 days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. Hikers had reported hearing singing coming from the old church, hymns, they said, with a full congregation joining in. The sheriff asked if I'd noticed anything unusual during my inspection. I hadn't, but something about the call bothered me. I'd been in that church for over an hour, and the silence had been absolute. No way a group of people could gather there without leaving some trace. But hikers get spooked easily in the mountains, especially around old religious sites. Probably just wind through the trees or their own imaginations. Still, I decided to make another trip. If someone was using the church for unauthorized gatherings, I needed to document it and contact the property owners. The church technically belonged to a religious trust in Knoxville, though they'd been trying to sell it for years. This time, I brought Dr. Sarah Whitman, a local historian who'd been helping me research some of the cultural sites. Sarah was in her 40s, sharp as a tack, and had written 3 books about Appalachian religious traditions. If anyone could explain what we were dealing with, it was her. We arrived just before sunset when the valley was filled with that golden light that makes everything look like a painting. Sarah was excited. She'd never seen a preserved snake-handling church before. Most had been demolished or converted after the practice was banned. "You have to understand," she explained as we walked toward the building. "These people weren't crazy. They were following biblical scripture literally. Mark 16:18. They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them." The front door was still unlocked. Inside, everything looked exactly the same as 3 days ago, except for one thing that made my blood run cold. The guest registry book was open to a fresh page, and someone had signed it. The ink looked wet. "Thomas Henderson, September 18th, 1984, Sarah read aloud. "Who's Thomas Henderson?" I flipped through the old entries, running my finger down the pages until I found it. Thomas Henderson, joined congregation April 3rd, 1965. Died August 12th, 1966. Snakebite during evening service. Sarah stared at me. "That's impossible. Someone's playing a prank." But the handwriting matched. Not similar. Identical. Down to the way he dotted his I's and crossed his T's. I'd seen enough historical documents to know when signatures were forged, and this wasn't a forgery. This was the same hand that had written in the book 18 years ago. We spent the next hour searching the building from top to bottom. No signs of recent occupancy. No footprints in the dust except our own. No disturbed areas, no hidden entrances. Just that fresh signature in a book that should have been gathering dust. As we prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something else. "Matt, look at the altar." The collection plates had moved. I was sure they'd been on the table by the door during my first visit. Empty, except for dust. Now they sat on the altar, and each one contained something that made my stomach turn. Dead mice. Dozens of them, arranged in perfect circles like offerings. Their bodies were fresh, still warm, but there were no signs of how they'd died. No blood, no bite marks, no obvious injuries. Just small, perfect corpses arranged with religious precision. "We need to leave," I said. The words came out harder than I'd intended. "Right now!" Sarah was taking pictures, her academic excitement overriding her common sense. "This is remarkable. It could be some kind of traditional practice, maybe related to harvest rituals or—" A sound cut her off. Faint at first, then growing stronger. Singing. Hymns, just like the hikers had reported. But it wasn't coming from outside the building or through the walls. It was coming from below us, rising up through the floorboards like voices from underground. The song was "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms," and it was being sung by a full congregation, men's. Voices, women's voices, children's voices, all blending together in perfect harmony. But there was something wrong with the harmony. It was too perfect, too unified, like the voices weren't quite human. Sarah grabbed my arm, her earlier excitement replaced by terror. "Where is that coming from?" I knew where it was coming from, even though I didn't want to admit it. The church had a basement. Most of these old buildings did, for storing supplies and sometimes for baptisms. But I hadn't seen any entrance during my inspection. The singing grew louder, and now I could hear other sounds mixed in. The shuffle of feet on wooden floors, the rustle of Sunday clothes, the whispered amens and hallelujahs of an active congregation. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran out of that church like it was on fire, and we didn't stop until we reached my truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As we drove away, I looked back through the rear window. Warm yellow light was glowing in the church windows, and I could see shadows moving inside. Shadows of people sitting in the pews, standing at the altar, raising their hands in worship. But we'd left the building empty and dark. I should have reported what we'd seen to the authorities. Should have contacted the property owners and recommended the building be sealed. Instead, I spent the next week trying to convince myself we'd imagined the whole thing. Acoustic tricks, shadow play, maybe even some kind of gas leak causing hallucinations. Sarah wasn't buying it. She called me every day with new theories, new research about the church's history. She'd found records in the county archives that painted a disturbing picture of the congregation's final years. It wasn't just snake handling, she told me during one of our phone calls. They were doing things that went way beyond normal Pentecostal practices. Multiple snake bites during single services, people speaking in tongues for hours without stopping, and the deaths. Matt, there were 17 deaths from snake bites in just 3 years. Normal snake handling churches might lose 1 or 2 members over decades. 17 deaths in 3 years suggested something else entirely, something that went beyond religious enthusiasm into dangerous territory. But what really scared me was the change I was seeing in Sarah. She'd always been a rational academic, the kind of person who analyzed folklore without believing in it. Now she was talking about genuine spiritual experiences and the possibility of divine intervention. She'd started attending services at a local Pentecostal church, something she'd never shown interest in before. A week after our second visit, she called me at home. It was late, after midnight, and her voice sounded strange, excited, but also frightened. I went back to the church, she said, by myself. Matt, you have to see what's happening there. My blood went cold. Sarah, what did you do? There was a service tonight, a real service. The whole congregation was there, singing and praying, and they invited me to join them. They knew my name, Matt. They knew I was coming. I was already reaching for my car keys. Where are you now? I'm still here, in the church. They're waiting for me to come back inside. They want to show me something special. They say I have the gift. The line went dead. I broke every speed limit getting back to that valley. My truck's headlights carved through the darkness as I navigated the winding mountain roads, and I could see a glow on the horizon long before I reached the church. Not the warm yellow light of electric bulbs, but something colder, more like moonlight, but coming from the wrong direction. The church was blazing with light when I arrived, every windows. You glowed, and I could hear the congregation inside, not just singing this time, but shouting, speaking in tongues, calling out in religious ecstasy. And underneath it all, a sound that made my skin crawl, the dry whisper of scales on wood. Sarah's car was parked next to the building, but she was nowhere in sight. I tried the front door and found it locked. The windows were too high to see through, but the sounds from inside were getting louder, more frantic. I ran around to the back of the building and found what I'd missed during my earlier inspections. A cellar entrance, hidden under years of overgrown vines. The wooden doors were open, and cold air flowed out like breath from a tomb. The basement was bigger than the church above it, carved directly into the mountain stone, and it was full of people, or things that looked like people. They sat in rows on wooden benches, facing a stone altar where Sarah stood with her arms raised toward the ceiling. She was holding a snake. A massive timber rattler, thick as my arm and at least 6 feet long. Its rattle was going constantly, a dry buzz that filled the underground space. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She was smiling, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, swaying back and forth as the serpent coiled around her arms. The congregation was watching her with dead eyes. I say dead because that's what they were. I could see it now. The gray skin, the hollow cheeks, the clothes that had rotted away to almost nothing. These were the members of the original congregation, the ones who'd died from snake bites over the years. And they'd been waiting down here all this time. At the center of them all was the pastor, a tall, thin man in a black suit that hung on his skeletal frame like a shroud. He was the only one who looked alive, though something in his eyes suggested he'd been dead longer than any of them. "Welcome, Brother Holiness," he said. and his voice carried perfectly across the stone chamber. "We've been expecting you. Your friend has such beautiful faith. She's ready to join us permanently." The snake around S. Ara's arms was growing larger. Not just longer, but thicker. And I realized it wasn't one snake at all. It was dozens of them, writhing together into a single massive serpent that pulsed with unnatural life. Sarah's smile was getting wider, and her eyes were rolling back in her head. "Stop!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the stone walls. "Let her go!" The pastor laughed. "She came to us willingly, seeking the ultimate test of faith, and she shall receive it. The serpent gives life to those who truly believe, and eternal service to those who fall short." The composite snake was wrapping tighter around Sarah's body now, and I could see its fangs extending. Not the short fangs of a normal viper, but curved daggers that dripped with venom so toxic it steamed in the cold air. I had seconds to act. The dead congregation was starting to turn toward me, and I could see more snakes slithering out of cracks in the stone walls. Hundreds of them, all moving with the same unnatural coordination. That's when I remembered something from my abandoned seminary education. Something about the difference between testing faith and destroying it. About protecting life instead of throwing it away. About the difference between divine presence and demonic deception. I started to pray. Not the formal prayers I'd memorized in school, but something desperate and honest. And for the first time in my life, I felt like something was listening. The moment I started praying, everything changed. The dead congregation hissed and recoiled like I'd thrown holy water on them. The pastor's confident smile twisted into a snarl of rage, and the massive serpent coiled around Sarah began to writhe in apparent pain. "You know nothing of faith," the pastor screamed. "You abandoned your calling. You have no power here." But I did have power, and I was finally beginning to understand why. Real faith sent about handling dangerous snakes or risking your life to prove devotion. It was about protecting others, about choosing wisdom over fanaticism, about recognizing the difference between divine guidance and demonic manipulation. The thing pretending to be a pastor wasn't a pastor at all. It never had been. It was something older and hungrier, something that fed on religious fervor and death. It had been hiding in this valley for decades, maybe centuries, wearing the mask of holy purpose while devouring genuine believers. "Sarah," I called out, "fight it! This isn't God testing your faith, it's something else entirely." She turned toward me, and for a moment her eyes cleared. The massive serpent loosened its grip slightly, and I saw her real expression underneath the religious ecstasy. She was terrified. "I can't move," she whispered. "It's in my head. It's making me want to be bitten, making me crave it." The pastor, the entity, was growing larger, its human disguise starting to slip. Its skin was taking on a scaled texture, and its eyes had become vertical slits. When it spoke, its voice carried the sound of 100 serpents hissing in unison. "She came seeking knowledge of true faith," it said. "We have given her exactly what she desired. Soon she will understand that death is the ultimate communion with the divine." The dead congregation was rising from their benches now, moving toward me with jerky, unnatural movements. Each of them carried snakes, and I could see the bite marks on their necks and arms, the wounds that had killed them, still fresh after all these years. I backed toward the cellar entrance, but more snakes were pouring down from above. The entire church had become a nest, and I was trapped in the heart of it. The only way out was through them. That's when I noticed something important. The snakes avoided certain areas of the basement, places where salt had spilled from old storage containers, spots where religious artifacts had fallen and broken. The entity was powerful, but it wasn't all-powerful. It could be fought. I grabbed a bag of rock salt from a shelf near the entrance and started spreading it in a circle around Sarah and the altar. The moment the salt hit the ground, the dead congregation screamed and pulled back. The massive serpent coiled around Sarah began to smoke and writhe. "Clever," the entity hissed, "but salt alone will not save you. This is our domain, consecrated with blood and death. Your puny faith cannot overcome decades of devoted sacrifice." It was right. The salt was slowing them down, but not stopping them. I needed something more, something that could break the entity's hold on this place permanently. And I thought I knew what it was. "You're not testing faith," I said, raising my voice so it echoed off the stone walls. "You're corrupting it, turning something beautiful into something poisonous. Real faith protects life. It doesn't destroy it." I started moving toward the wooden support beams that held up the church above us. If I could bring down the building, I might be able to trap the entity and its dead congregation in the basement. It would mean destroying a historic site, but some things were more important than preservation. The entity realized what I was planning and sent its servants after me. Dead hands grabbed at my clothes, and fangs struck at my arms and legs. I felt venom burning in my bloodstream, but adrenaline and desperate purpose kept me moving. Sarah was fighting too, struggling against the serpent that held her. "Matt," she called out, "the altar! There's something carved into the stone." I looked where she was pointing and saw it. Symbols cut deep into the altar's surface. Not Christian symbols, but something older and darker. A binding circle that had trapped the entity here, forcing it to work through deception and gradual corruption instead of direct attack. "Break the altar," Sarah screamed. "Break the binding." It was the opposite of what you'd expect, destroying a religious artifact to banish a demon. But this altar had never been holy. It was a prison, and the entity had been using it to anchor itself to our world while slowly growing stronger through the deaths of believers. I grabbed a pickaxe from the tools near the cellar entrance and swung it at the carved symbols with everything I had. The first blow sent cracks spider-webbing across the stone. The second blow brought down chunks of rock. And with the third blow, the altar shattered completely. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The entity's human disguise dissolved entirely, revealing something that was part snake, part shadow, and part raw hunger. It screamed with voices of all the people it had devoured over the years, and the sound shattered every light bulb in the basement. The dead congregation was collapsing too, their borrowed animation failing as the entity's power weakened. But it wasn't dead yet, just freed from its binding. And now it was angry. "If I cannot have this place," it roared, "then no one shall have it." The wooden support beams began to crack and splinter. The entity was bringing down the entire church, planning to trap us all in the collapsing basement. I had maybe 30 seconds before tons of wood and stone came crashing down. I grabbed Sarah as the massive serpent finally released her, and we ran for the cellar entrance. Behind us, the entity was expanding to fill the entire basement, its serpentine form becoming something vast and terrible. The dead congregation was dissolving into shadow and dust, their borrowed time finally running out. We made it to the entrance, just as the church above began to collapse. I threw Sarah out of the cellar and followed her as timber and stone thundered down behind us. The building folded in on itself like a house of cards, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that blotted out the stars. When the noise finally stopped, there was nothing left but a pile of rubble in a mountain valley. And underneath that rubble, something ancient and hungry was finally buried where it belonged. The fire department said it was an electrical problem in the old wiring. The county said the building had been structurally unsound for years, and they were surprised it hadn't collapsed sooner. The insurance company paid out the claim to the religious trust in Knoxville without asking too many questions. Nobody mentioned the basement full of perfectly preserved corpses, or the fact that the building had no electrical system to begin with. Some truths are too complicated for official reports. Sarah spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from multiple snake bites and what the doctors called severe religious hysteria. They pumped her full of antivenom and sedatives, and gradually the supernatural compulsion faded from her eyes. But she was never quite the same. She'd touched something beyond normal human experience, and it left marks that went deeper than fang wounds. She quit her job at the university and moved to Florida, as far from the mountains as she could get. Last I heard, she was working as a librarian and had sworn off anything related to religious studies. She sent me a postcard once with just 4 words. Some knowledge costs too much. I understood what she meant. I kept working in the Cherokee Forest for another 5 years, but I couldn't handle churches anymore. Every time I walked into an abandoned religious building, I'd start sweating and my hands would shake. The department transferred me to secular historical sites, old mills, homesteads, trading posts, places where the worst thing you might encounter was a family of raccoons or some broken glass. The nightmares took longer to fade. For months after the church collapsed, I'd wake up hearing that dry whisper of scales on wood. I'd check my bedroom for snakes, knowing it was irrational but unable to stop myself. Even now, 20 years later, I can't look at a timber rattler without feeling my heart race. But the strangest thing was what happened to other snake-handling churches in the region. Over the following year, several pastors reported that they'd lost the anointing for serpent handling. They said it just didn't feel right anymore, that the practice had lost its spiritual power. Most of them transitioned to more conventional Pentecostal worship, much to the relief of their families and the state health department. It was like the entity's destruction had somehow broken a wider pattern of supernatural manipulation, as if its influence had been spreading through underground networks of belief and practice, corrupting genuine faith traditions into something darker and more dangerous. I never told anyone the full story until now. Who would believe it? But I've kept track of reports from other abandoned religious sites across Appalachia, and I'm not the only ranger who's encountered things that don't belong in any official manual. The mountains have always been places of spiritual power. Native Americans knew it, early settlers felt it, and modern visitors still sense something in the deep woods and hidden valleys. But not all spiritual power comes from the same source, and not all religious experiences lead toward the light. I retired early, in 2002, and moved down to Chattanooga, where the supernatural seems to have less of a foothold. I volunteer with a cult awareness organization now, helping families understand the difference between healthy spiritual seeking and dangerous religious manipulation. I can't tell them about demons and serpent entities, but I can teach them to recognize when faith becomes fanaticism, when devotion becomes destruction. The work helps, most of the time. It feels like I'm using what I learned in that collapsed church for something positive. But every now and then, I get a reminder that some things don't stay buried. Last month, I found a package on my doorstep. No return address, no delivery notice. Inside was a single photograph of the rubble where Serpent's Holiness Church used to stand. Yuan had taken the picture recently. I could tell from the way the vegetation had grown over the site. But what made my blood run cold was what was written on the back of the photo, in handwriting I recognized from a church registry book 20 years ago. "The congregation misses your testimony, Brother Holiness. We're planning a revival meeting. Hope to see you soon." I've been thinking about moving again. Maybe somewhere with less history, fewer mountains, and definitely fewer churches. But I'm starting to suspect that some things follow you no matter how far you run. The truth is, there are places in this world where the boundary between the spiritual and physical gets thin. Places where ancient hungers still wait in the darkness, wearing masks of divine purpose. And sometimes, despite our best efforts to bury them, they find ways to dig themselves back up. If you're ever exploring old religious sites and you feel a sudden compulsion to participate in dangerous practices, to handle venomous snakes, to drink poison, to prove your faith through potentially fatal acts, that's not divine inspiration. That's something else entirely. Something that feeds on devotion and grows stronger with each death. Some spirits wear holy masks, but their fruits are always the same: fear, fanaticism, and graves filled too soon. The mountains remember everything, and some congregations never really disband. They just move underground and wait for new believers to find them. Trust me on this one. I've seen their work firsthand, and the scars still ache when it rains. My name is Franklin Greenwood, but everyone calls me Frank. I've been managing forests in North Carolina for 19 years now. My daddy did it before me, and his daddy before him. We Greenwoods have been walking these mountains since the 1920s, and I thought I knew every tree, every trail, every sound the woods could make. I was wrong. It was June of 1988 when everything changed. The federal boys had sent me into Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest to do something that made my stomach turn: mark trees for cutting. Even selective logging in a virgin forest felt like sacrilege, but the park needed money for maintenance. My job was to find which trees could be harvested without destroying the grove's ancient beauty. Joyce Kilmer isn't like other forests. The tulip poplars there are 400 years old, some reaching nearly 400 feet tall. When you walk among them, it's like being inside a cathedral made of living wood. The canopy is so thick that even at noon, you're walking in green twilight. The air smells different there, older, richer, like the earth itself is breathing. I'd been in that grove dozens of times, but never with paint and marking equipment. Never as someone planning to cut down trees that were already giants when the first Europeans set foot in these mountains. The Cherokee used to say the grove was sacred. My grandfather told me stories about it, warnings really, about how some forests protect themselves. But I never believed in tree spirits or forest magic. I was a forester, a man of science. Trees were timber, carbon dioxide processors, wildlife habitat. Nothing more. I should have listened to those old stories. The morning I started the marking survey, everything seemed normal. My equipment worked fine. Measuring tape, diameter calipers, spray paint for marking. I had my clipboards with the federal forestry forms, all neat and organized. Standard. Protocol called for measuring each tree's diameter, checking for disease or damage, then marking the ones that could be safely harvested. The first tree I marked was a beauty. A tulip poplar about 200 years old, healthy but not quite ancient enough to be protected. I wrapped my measuring tape around its trunk, noted the diameter, checked for any signs of rot or insect damage, clean bill of health. Then I shook my can of orange spray paint and marked a big X on the bark. The sound of the paint hitting the tree seemed too loud in the quiet forest. Even the birds had stopped singing. I moved to the next tree, then the next. Each one I marked felt heavier than the last, like I was signing death warrants instead of forest management papers. But it was my job, and the Greenwood family had always done their jobs in these woods. By lunchtime, I'd marked 12 trees. Good progress for a morning's work. I sat on a fallen log and ate my sandwich, looking up at the canopy. Somewhere high above, I could hear the wind moving through the leaves, but down where I sat, the air was perfectly still. That's when I noticed something strange. The orange X I'd painted on the first tree looked faded. Not just faded, smeared like someone had tried to wipe it off. I walked over for a closer look. The paint was definitely smudged, but there were no fingerprints, no tool marks. It looked like the tree itself had been sweating orange paint. Weird, I muttered, and repainted the mark. The rest of that day went smoothly enough, though I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every forester knows that feeling. Usually means there's a bear or maybe a wildcat nearby. But every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees. That night, I camped at the ranger station 15 miles away. In the morning, I helicopter dropped back into the grove to continue the survey. Every single tree I'd marked. The day before was clean. No orange paint anywhere. I stood there staring at unmarked bark, my clipboard hanging loose in my hand. 18 years of forestry experience, and I'd never seen anything like it. Paint doesn't just disappear overnight, especially not the heavy-duty marking paint we used. That stuff was designed to last through winter weather. Maybe vandals, I thought. Environmental activists trying to stop the logging. But the grove was 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by helicopter or a brutal day-long hike. And there were no footprints. No signs anyone else had been there. I repainted all 12 trees, working faster this time. The whole grove felt different somehow, quieter, more watchful. When I accidentally dropped my measuring tape, it bounced once and somehow got tangled around a branch 20 feet above my head. I had to climb up to get it back, cursing the whole time. The second day's work went slower. My equipment kept acting up. The diameter calipers would stick at weird measurements, my pencil kept breaking, and twice my paint can got knocked out of my hand by low-hanging branches that I swear hadn't been there moments before. But I finished marking 6 more trees before heading back to the station. The third morning, I knew something was seriously wrong before I even got off the helicopter. All 18 trees were unmarked again, but that wasn't the worst part. My measuring tape was hanging from a branch 50 feet up, tied in a perfect bow. Not tangled, tied, like someone with very long arms and a sense of humor had been playing with my equipment. "You see anything weird when you dropped me off yesterday?" I asked the pilot. Jim shook his head. "Nothing but trees, Frank. Same as always. You sure you marked the right trees?" I was sure. I'd been marking trees for nearly 2 decades. I didn't make mistakes like that. After Jim flew away, leaving me alone in the grove, I stood looking up at my measuring tape. There was no way to get it down without climbing gear. And there was no way it had gotten there naturally. Something was messing with me. I pulled out my backup measuring tape and started working, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every sound made me jump. The creak of wood, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig. Normal forest sounds that had never bothered me before. Around noon, I found the first real evidence that something was seriously wrong. In a small clearing between 2 massive poplars, I discovered what looked like a logger's camp from decades ago. An old double-bit axe lay half buried in moss, its wooden handle gray with age. Nearby were the remains of a canvas tent and some rusted camping gear. But it was the axe that made my blood run cold. The blade was buried 3 inches deep in the trunk of one of the giant poplars, not lying against it, buried in it. The tree had grown around the metal, absorbing it into its bark like a scar. I tried to pull the axe free, but it wouldn't budge. The tree had claimed it completely. That's when I noticed the other marks. All around the clearing, the big trees bore scars, old cut marks that had healed over but remained visible as dark lines in the bark. Someone had tried to log this grove before, and the trees still remembered. I found more evidence as the afternoon wore on. A rusty saw blade, its teeth buried in bark. A pair of work boots sitting upright at the base of a tree. So old they'd turned to leather scraps, but positioned like someone had just stepped out of them. The most disturbing find was a faded sign nailed to a poplar trunk. Kellerman Logging, 1934. The nails had been completely absorbed by the tree, and the wood of the sign had started to merge with the bark, like the tree was slowly eating it. I checked my clipboard. According to the historical records, there had never been any logging operations in Joyce-Kilmer Grove. It had been protected since the 1930s, but the evidence was right there in front of me. I tried to radio back to the station, but my radio produced nothing but static. Not unusual in the mountains, but it added to my growing unease. I was completely cut off from the outside world. Alone in a forest that was starting to feel less like wilderness and more like something that was alive and watching. That evening, as I set up my temporary camp in the grove, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Growing sounds. At first, I thought it was just the normal creaking and settling that trees do as temperatures change. But this was different. It was rhythmic, purposeful, like the sound of someone slowly stretching, but magnified and echoing through the wood. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the canopy, listening to the forest grow around me. The sounds weren't random. They seemed to be coming from the trees I'd marked for cutting. In the morning, I understood why. Every marked tree had grown. Not the normal, imperceptible growth that happens over months and years. Real, visible growth. The tulip poplar I'd measured at 4 feet diameter was now 4 feet and 3 inches. The orange X I'd painted on its bark was stretched and distorted like the tree had expanded overnight. I measured all 18 trees again. Every single one had grown between 2 and 4 inches in diameter. In one night. That was impossible. Trees didn't grow that fast, especially not ancient hardwoods like these. I sat on a fallen log, staring at my measurements, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In 19 years of forestry work, I'd never encountered anything like this. Trees that erased paint marks, equipment that moved itself around, and now impossible growth rates. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe some kind of mineral deposit affecting the water table, maybe electromagnetic fields from underground ore deposits interfering with my equipment. Maybe I was just tired and making measurement errors. But deep down, I was starting to think about those Cherokee stories my grandfather used to tell. Stories about forests that protected themselves. Stoned. Rise about trees with spirits. stories I'd always dismissed as folklore. Maybe folklore existed for a reason. As I packed up my equipment, preparing to hike to a spot where my radio might work, I noticed something that made my hands shake. New footprints in the soft earth around my campsite, but not human footprints. These were shaped like feet, but made of roots. Small rootlets pressed into the ground in the pattern of toes, larger roots forming the shape of heels and arches. Like someone made of living wood had walked around my camp while I slept, and they led toward the deepest part of the grove, where the oldest and largest trees grew. I should have left right then, should have hiked out, called in sick, and requested a transfer to any forest that didn't have impossible trees and root-print visitors. But the Greenwood family had never run from anything in these mountains, and I wasn't about to start. Besides, I needed answers. I followed the root prints deeper into the grove, past trees so massive that 5 men holding hands couldn't have circled them. The air grew thicker, older, filled with the smell of rich earth and something else. Something wild and green and ancient. The prints led to a clearing I'd never seen before, though I thought I knew every inch of Joyce Kilmer Grove. In the center stood the largest tulip poplar I'd ever encountered, easily 6 feet across and reaching so high I couldn't see its crown. Its bark was scarred with what looked like claw marks, but as I got closer, I realized they were more old logging cuts, healed over, and grown into the tree's skin like permanent reminders of past wounds. At the base of the giant tree, I found something that made my stomach drop. A skeleton sitting upright against the trunk, still wearing the tattered remains of work clothes. In its bony hands was a rusted crosscut saw positioned like the dead man had been, in trying to cut the tree when something stopped him permanently. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the skeleton wasn't just leaning against the tree. It was part of, root tendrils had grown through the rib cage, wrapping around the bones like the tree was slowly digesting its victim. Moss covered the skull like green hair, and tiny saplings sprouted from the eye sockets. I stumbled backward, my rational mind trying to reject what I was seeing. People didn't get absorbed by trees. Skeletons didn't sit upright for decades without falling apart. This had to be some kind of weird art installation, or maybe a Halloween prank that had been left behind. But the bones looked real, the clothes looked real, and when I worked up the courage to check the shirt pocket, I found a moldy wallet with a driver's license issued to William Kellerman in 1934. The same name from the logging sign I'd found the day before. I took pictures with my camera, though I wasn't sure anyone would believe them. As I backed away from the tree, I noticed something else that made my hands shake. Fresh cut marks in the bark, right above where Kellerman's remains sat. Someone had been trying to cut this tree recently. Someone with a chainsaw. And there were more root prints around the base of the tree. Lots of them, like a whole crowd of wooden feet had gathered here. I spent the rest of the day exploring the clearing, finding more evidence of the forest's strange hunger. Another skeleton, this one tangled in the roots of a smaller poplar, wearing clothes that looked like they were from the 1950s. A third set of bones, newer looking, wrapped in the low branches of an oak tree like a macabre Christmas ornament. All loggers, based on their equipment. All apparently absorbed by the trees they'd tried to cut. That night I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree at the edge of the clearing, my emergency flare gun in one hand and my camera in the other, waiting for something to happen. I didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, the growing sounds started again. But now, I could see what was making them. The trees were moving, swaying without any wind, their branches reaching toward each other like they were having a conversation in slow motion. Root systems shifted under the ground, making the earth ripple like water. And then I saw them. Figures made of living wood, walking between the trees like they belonged there. They moved slowly, deliberately, tending to the forest like gardeners. Some were tall and thin like saplings, others broad and gnarled like old oaks. Their faces were just suggestions, knots and bark patterns that almost looked like eyes and mouths in the dim light. The wooden people ignored me at first, going about their business of adjusting branches, moving fallen logs, and doing things to the soil that I couldn't quite see. But when one of them approached the tree where Kellerman's skeleton sat, I understood what they really were. Caretakers. Guardians. The spirits of everyone the forest had claimed over the years, still protecting the grove that had absorbed them. One of the figures noticed me watching and turned in my direction. Its face was more detailed than the others. I could make out individual features carved from bark and wood. It looked almost human, except for the glowing amber eyes that seemed to hold centuries of forest memory. It pointed at me, then at the tree behind me. The message was clear enough. Join us or leave. Those were my options. I chose to leave, scrambling to my feet and crashing through the underbrush toward the edge of the grove. Behind me, I could hear the wooden people moving faster, their footsteps making sounds like breaking branches, but they didn't chase me beyond the clearing. When I looked back, they had returned to their work, tending their ancient garden. I hiked through the night, reaching the ranger station just as the sun came up. My supervisor, Carl Martinez, too. One look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Frank, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," I said. "I've seen the reason why some trees should never be cut." Carl didn't. Believe me at first. Who would? I was talking about walking trees and wooden people and skeletons that had been absorbed by bark. It sounded crazy, even to me. But when I showed him the photographs, his face went pale. "Jesus, Frank. How long have those bones been there?" "The oldest ones? Maybe 50 years. The newest? I don't know. Could be recent." Carl was quiet for a long time, studying the pictures. Finally, he pulled out a file cabinet and retrieved a folder marked Historical Incidents, Classified. "There's something you should see," he said, spreading out papers on his desk. 3 people have gone missing in Joyce Kilmer Grove over the past decade. All of them were trying to cut trees illegally. The files made my blood run cold. A poacher in 1979 who'd been cutting firewood. A timber thief in 1983 trying to steal old-growth lumber. And just last year, a man with a chainsaw who'd been planning to cut down trees for expensive wood furniture. All 3 had disappeared without a trace. Search parties had found their vehicles, their camping gear, even their chainsaws in some cases. But no bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of where they'd gone. "The local Cherokee Tribal Council warned us this might happen," Carl continued. "They said the grove was protected by something older than federal law. We thought they were just being superstitious." "Maybe they weren't wrong," I said. That afternoon, Carl flew back to the grove with me. He wanted to see the evidence himself, and honestly, I was glad for the company. The grove felt different in daylight with another person there. Less threatening, but no less strange. Carl whistled when he saw the Kellerman skeleton. "This explains a lot. My grandfather used to work for the Forest Service back in the 30s. He always said something happened to the Kellerman logging crew, but the official reports claimed they just gave up and left." "Looks like they didn't leave," I said. We found 2 more skeletons that day, including one wearing modern clothing and hiking boots. The most recent victim, probably the chainsaw man from the year before. Like the others, he'd been partially absorbed by the tree he'd tried to cut, his remains positioned like he was still working when the forest claimed him. "We need to report this," Carl said, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "The FBI, maybe, or the state police." "And tell them what? That trees are eating people?" Before Carl could answer, we heard the sound of a chainsaw starting up somewhere deeper in the grove. We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Someone else was in the grove trying to cut trees. Someone who had no idea what they were walking into. We followed the sound, moving as quickly as we could through the thick underbrush. The chainsaw noise was coming from the direction of the big clearing where I'd seen the wooden people the night before. What we found there changed everything. A woman in her 30s, wearing expensive hiking gear and carrying professional logging equipment, was trying to cut down the massive tulip poplar where Kellerman's skeleton sat. She'd already made a good notch in the trunk, and wood chips were flying everywhere. "Stop!" I shouted, running toward her. "You need to stop right now." She turned off the chainsaw and looked at us with irritation. "Who are you? This is public land. I have a right to be here." "Not to cut trees, you don't," Carl said, showing his Forest Service badge. This is a protected grove. Tree cutting is strictly forbidden." The woman laughed. "Do you have any idea how much old-growth tulip poplar is worth? This one tree could pay for my kids' college education." I tried to explain, tried to warn her about what happened to people who cut trees in the grove. Oh, but she thought we were just trying to scare her off so we could come back and take the valuable timber ourselves. She started up the chainsaw again. That's when the grove woke up. The first sign was the birds. Every bird in the forest started screaming at once, not singing, screaming. The sound was deafening, primal, like the voice of the forest itself crying out in pain. Then the trees started moving. Not swaying, moving. Branches reached down toward the woman like massive wooden arms. Roots erupted from the ground around her feet, trying to trip her up. The massive tulip poplar she was cutting began to sway dangerously, even though there was no wind. "What the hell?" the woman started to say, but her words were cut off as a root the size of a python wrapped around her ankle. Carl and I tried to help her, grabbing her arms and pulling while she fought to stay upright. But more roots were emerging from the earth, and the trees around the clearing were bending inward like they were trying to close the space around us. That's when the timber giant appeared. It rose from the ground in the center of the clearing, 30 feet tall and made of living wood. Its body was formed from intertwined branches and vines, its face carved from ancient bark. Its eyes glowed with the same amber light I'd seen in the wooden people, but brighter, older, filled with the accumulated wisdom and anger of centuries. When it spoke, its voice sounded like wind through leaves, like the creaking of old trees, like the earth itself groaning. "Enough!" The single word echoed through the grove, making every tree vibrate like a tuning fork. The woman dropped her chainsaw, staring up at the giant in terror. "You cut," the timber giant said, its voice growing stronger. "You take, you destroy. For too long we have watched. No more." Roots burst from the ground around all three of us, but they moved differently toward me than toward the others. Where they grabbed Carl and the woman like restraints, they approached me almost gently, like they were questioning rather than threatening. "Yo," the giant said, focusing its amber gaze on me. "You mark trees for cutting, but you understand. You listen. You can choose." The choice was clear. Join the forest, become part of its protection system like all the other absorbed loggers, or find another way to serve its needs. "What do you want?" I asked. "Partnership," the giant replied. "Not destruction, not theft. Work with the forest, not against it. Protect what cannot be replaced." The deal we struck that day changed everything. The woman, her name was Sandra Chen, and she was a furniture maker from Asheville, became the first person to be released by the grove after being caught cutting trees. But it came with conditions. She had to spend a month helping with forest restoration work, and she had to promise never to cut old-growth timber again. The timber giant somehow marked her, giving her bark-like patches on her hands that would remind her of her promise for the rest of her life. Carl went back to the ranger station with a new understanding of what we were really protecting in Joyce Kilmer Grove. He filed a report that attributed our findings to unusual preservation conditions and archaeological discoveries requiring further study. The grove was reclassified as permanently protected, with no logging allowed under any circumstances. As for me, I became something new. Not quite human, not quite tree, but something in between. The partial transformation happened gradually over the following weeks. Patches of my skin developed a bark-like texture, especially on my hands and forearms. My hair turned the deep green of moss. I found I needed less food and more sunlight, like I was developing the ability to photosynthesize. But the biggest change was in how I understood forests. I could sense the health of trees by touching them, feel the communication networks that ran through root systems, understand the complex relationships that made a forest more than just a collection of individual trees. My wife Martha was scared at first. The physical changes were dramatic enough that I had to take medical leave while we figured out how to explain them. We told people I'd had an allergic reaction to some rare plant compounds. Most folks accepted that explanation, especially when they saw how much my forestry work improved, because it did improve. dramatically. Trees responded to me now like I was speaking their language. I could identify diseased trees from 100 yards away, predict which ones would fall in storms, and somehow encourage healthy growth in damaged areas. My success rate for forest restoration projects became legendary within the Forest Service. Other rangers started calling me the Tree Whisperer, though they didn't know how literal that nickname was. The Joyce Kilmer Grove became my special responsibility. I visited every month, checking on the timber giant and the wooden people who tend the forest. They've accepted me as a bridge between their world and the human world, and I've learned to accept my role as guardian and translator. Sometimes I find evidence of people who've tried to enter the grove with chainsaws or axes. The forest deals with them more gently now that there's someone to negotiate. Usually they just find themselves lost and confused, walking in circles until they give up and leave. The truly persistent ones get the full treatment: roots that grab, branches that block, and if necessary, a visit from the wooden people. But the grove has kept its side of the bargain. No one else has been absorbed by the trees since Sandra Chen's close call. I've started consulting with other forest services around the country, helping them identify groves that might be more than they appear. The Cherokee Nation has been especially helpful, sharing stories about other protected forests where the trees have developed their own defense mechanisms. It turns out Joyce Kilmer isn't unique. There are old-growth forests all over North America where trees have learned to protect themselves. Most of them are more subtle than my grove, content to hide from humans or make themselves unappealing to loggers. But a few are actively defensive, and those require careful management. My son David, who's studying forestry at NC State, thinks I've become some kind of ecological mystic. He's not wrong. When you can feel the emotions of trees and hear the conversations happening through root networks, it's hard to think of forests as just timber resources. Martha has gotten used to my changes, especially since they seem to be stabilizing. The bark-like patches on my skin actually make for good conversation starters at forestry conferences, and she admits that our garden has never looked better. But the real change is in how I think about my job. I'm not a forest manager anymore. I'm a forest guardian. My role isn't to decide which trees live or die, but to help people understand that some things are worth more standing than cut down. Last week I found a perfectly carved wooden bird on my doorstep. No tool marks, no rough edges, just a chickadee made from what looked like a single piece of tulip poplar, complete down to individual feathers. Inside the hollow body was a note written in bark script. Thank you for listening. The grove is still there, still protected, still tended by its wooden guardians. The timber giant sleeps most of the time now, satisfied that someone is watching out for its ancient trees. But I know it's always ready to wake up if the need arises. And sometimes, late at night when I'm walking through any forest, I can hear them all: the trees, the roots, the underground networks of communication that connect every living plant in the ecosystem. They're talking about the weather, about soil conditions, about the animals that live among them. And occasionally they're talking about the humans who walk among discussing which ones understand and which ones still need to learn. If you work in forests and ever feel like the trees are watching you, trust that instinct. They probably are. And if you listen carefully, you might hear what they're trying to tell you. Some things are worth more than the money they'd bring. Some places are sacred, not because of human laws, but because of laws older than civilization. And some forests have been taking care of themselves for longer than we've been taking care of anything. The Greenwood family has been working these mountains for 4 generations now. But we've learned that we're not the managers here. We're just the translators, helping 2 very different kinds of intelligence find ways to coexist. It's a good job if you don't mind getting a little bark on your skin. My name is Elizabeth Mountainheart, but everyone calls me Libby. I've been a park ranger for 21 years now, and I thought I knew everything about rocks and mountains. I studied geology in college, got my PhD, and spent my whole career reading the land like a book. Every crack in the stone tells a story. Every layer shows you what happened millions of years ago. But in December of 1991, up on Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina, I learned that some stories are still being written. And some mountains remember everything. I was 48 then, working the Blue Ridge Parkway between North Carolina and Virginia. My job was simple: check the rocks, make sure they weren't going to fall on tourists, and keep the mountain safe for visitors. I loved it. There's something peaceful about being alone with stone and sky, just you and the ancient peaks that have been here since before humans ever walked the earth. Grandfather Mountain was special, though. The Cherokee people always said it was sacred, that the Great Spirit lived in those rocks. The quartzite cliffs were over 1 billion years old, some of the oldest stone on the planet. When you touched those rocks, you could almost feel the weight of all that time. The Cherokee elder, Joseph Stands Tall, used to tell me stories when I'd run into him on the trails. He said his people believed the mountain stored memories in its stone, like a giant library made of rock. I always smiled and nodded. It was beautiful folklore, but I was a scientist. Mountains were just geological formations. They didn't think or remember anything. That December morning started normal enough. I was driving up the winding road to check on some seismic equipment we'd placed near the peak. We'd been getting strange readings for weeks, little earthquakes that didn't make sense. They weren't following any pattern I recognized from my geology books. The tremors seemed almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The snow was falling heavy that day, big fat flakes that stuck to everything. My truck's heater was working overtime, and I could barely see the road through the windshield. But I'd driven these mountains in worse weather. The equipment was expensive, and if a storm knocked it over, my boss would have my head. As I climbed higher, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The snow was falling normally, the wind was normal, but there was something in the air. A feeling, like when you know someone's watching you but you can't see them. I shook it off. After 2 decades in these mountains, you start imagining things. But when I reached the parking area near the peak, I saw the first sign that this wasn't going to be a normal day. The boulders near the trail, massive chunks of quartzite that had been there for thousands of years, had moved. I knew those rocks like old friends. I'd measured them, photographed them, used them as landmarks in my reports. But now they were different. Not by much, maybe a few feet, but when you're dealing with stones that weigh several tons each, a few feet might as well be a mile. I got out of my truck and walked over to where the biggest boulder used to sit. There was a perfect circle of grass underneath, brown and flattened, showing exactly where it had been. The boulder itself was now 10 feet away, sitting pretty as you please like nothing had happened. My scientific mind kicked in. Maybe the recent earthquakes had shifted them, but the tremors we'd recorded weren't nearly strong enough to move rocks this size. And the way they'd moved, it wasn't random. They formed a pattern, like someone had arranged them on purpose. I followed the trail up toward my equipment, trying to think of logical explanations. Frost heave, maybe. Underground water shifting. There had to be a reason that made sense. The seismograph was still running, printing out its wavy lines on the paper roll. I checked the readings from the past week and felt my stomach drop. The pattern was even clearer on paper. The mountain wasn't just having earthquakes. It was having regular tremors every 12 hours, like clockwork, like breathing. That's when I heard it, a sound I'd never heard before in 21 years of mountain work. It was low and deep, coming from inside the rock itself. Not quite a rumble, not quite a voice, but something in between. It made my teeth ache and my bones feel hollow. I looked around, but I was alone on the peak. Just me, the falling snow, and a sound that seemed to be coming from the mountain itself. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. I stood there for 5 minutes, listening, but heard nothing except wind and my own heartbeat. I checked my equipment again, thinking maybe it had picked up the noise, but the seismograph showed normal background vibration. I spent the next hour doing my usual checks. The weather station was working fine, recording temperature and wind speed. The motion sensors I'd placed to detect rock slides were all green. Everything seemed normal except for those moved boulders and that impossible sound. By noon, the snow had stopped and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. I was packing up my gear when I noticed something that made me freeze. On the cliff face about 50 yards away, there was a carving in the rock. I'd been coming to this exact spot for 5 years. I knew every crack, every stain, every shadow on that cliff. The carving hadn't been there before. But there it was, clear as day. A spiral pattern cut deep into the quartzite, with symbols around the edge that looked like Cherokee writing. The stone around the carving was smooth, like it had been polished. But quartzite is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. You'd need diamond-tipped tools and hours of work to cut through it. And the symbols looked old, weathered, like they'd been there for centuries. I walked closer, my boots crunching on snow and loose rocks. The carving was about 6 feet across, and as I got nearer, I could see more details. The spiral seemed to go deeper than the surface, disappearing into the rock itself. And the symbols, I'd seen some of them before, in the Cherokee stories Joseph had told me. I reached out to touch the carving, and the moment my fingers made contact with the stone, everything changed. The world flickered, like someone had switched a television channel. For just a second, I wasn't looking at snow-covered rock in 1991. I was seeing the same cliff face, but it was summer, and there were people there. Cherokee people, dressed in traditional clothes, gathered around a fire. They were chanting, and one of them, an old woman with silver hair, was pressing her hands against the exact spot where I was touching. Then it was gone, and I was back in the cold December afternoon, my hand still on the stone. I jerked my hand away and stumbled backward. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. What I'd seen was impossible. Hallucinations didn't work that way. They didn't have that kind of detail, that kind of clarity. I tried to convince myself I was having altitude sickness or maybe carbon monoxide poisoning from my truck. But I felt fine otherwise, and I'd been at this elevation thousands of times before. I walked back to my equipment, trying to focus on normal, scientific things. But as I bent down to pick up my clipboard, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Voices. Multiple voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand. They seemed to be coming from the rock itself, echoing up from deep inside the mountain. I looked around frantically, but I was still alone. The voices continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, like people having a conversation in a room below me. But there was no room below me. There was nothing but solid rock for hundreds of feet down. I pressed my ear to the ground, thinking maybe there was a cave system I didn't know about. The voices got clearer, and I realized some of them were speaking English, Old English, with accents I'd heard in historical movies. "The Cherokee know," one voice said. "They've always known. The mountain remembers." "We're part of it now," another voice replied. "Part of the memory." I sat up so fast I got dizzy. Those voices weren't coming from caves or underground chambers. They were coming from the stone itself, like the rock was playing back conversations from the past. I grabbed my seismograph readings and started running down the trail to my truck. Whatever was happening up here, it was beyond my training. I needed to get back to the ranger station and call my supervisor, maybe even call the university geology department. But as I reached my truck, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were new tracks in the snow around my vehicle, not animal tracks, human footprints, bare human footprints, leading from the woods to my truck and then back again. The footprints were fresh, made after the snow stopped falling, but I hadn't seen another person all day. And who walks barefoot in December snow at 5,000 feet elevation? I followed the tracks with my eyes, and they led straight to a section of cliff face I'd never paid much attention to before. As I watched, I swear I saw movement there, just for a second, like someone stepping behind the rock itself. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The echo of my voice bounced off the cliffs, but there was no answer. Just silence and the weird feeling that I was being watched by something that didn't want to be seen. I got in my truck and started the engine, but before I could drive away, I heard that deep sound again, the one that came from inside the mountain. This time it was different, though. This time it almost sounded like words, like the mountain was trying to tell me something. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that carving, heard those voices from the rock. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was stress and too much coffee. Mountains don't remember things. Stone doesn't talk. I was a scientist, damn it. But when I got to work and told my supervisor about the moved boulders, he frowned and pulled out a file. We've had 3 reports this week about Grandfather Mountain, he said. Hikers claiming they saw things that weren't there. A family saying they heard Cherokee ceremonies at night. And yesterday a rock climber swore he watched a cliff face change shape while he was looking at it. Equipment malfunction, I suggested, though I knew it sounded weak. Maybe. But corporate wants you to go back up there. Document everything. If there's geological instability, we need to know before tourist season starts. So I found myself driving back up the mountain, this time with Joseph stands tall in my passenger seat. I'd called him the night before, figuring if anyone understood what was happening, it would be someone who grew up with the Cherokee stories. Joseph was in his 70s, with long gray hair and hands that looked like tree bark. He'd been teaching Cherokee history at the Cultural Center for decades, and he knew more about Grandfather Mountain than anyone alive. My grandmother told me this would happen someday, he said as we drove up the winding road. She said the mountain was patient, but not forever. When white people started forgetting the old ways, forgetting to respect the land, the mountain would remind them. Remind them how? I asked. Joseph smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. By showing them what it's seen. All of it. Every prayer, every battle, every death, every birth that's happened on its slopes for 1,000 years. We parked at the same spot as yesterday. The boulders had moved again. This time they formed what looked almost like a circle, with the carved cliff face at the center. The carving itself had changed too. New symbols had appeared, and the spiral was deeper. "Grandmother's marks," Joseph whispered, staring at the symbols. "These are memory markers, ways to store important events in stone." "How do you store events in stone?" I asked, though part of me was afraid of the answer. Instead of replying, Joseph walked to the largest boulder and placed both hands on its surface. Immediately, his expression changed. His eyes went wide, and he started speaking Cherokee in a rapid, excited voice. "What do you see?" I called to him. "My people," he said without taking his hands off the rock. "I see them building the first memory markers, 200 years ago. He stopped suddenly and jerked his hands away. "They're warning about something that's coming." Before I could ask what he meant, the ground under our feet started shaking. Not an earthquake. I knew what those felt like. This was different, rhythmic, like something enormous was moving deep underground. The carved spiral on the cliff face began to glow, not with electric light, but with something that came from inside the stone itself. The glow spread outward from the spiral, following the cracks in the rock until the entire cliff face was lit up like a map of veins. "We need to leave," Joseph said, but his voice sounded strange, distant. I looked at him and gasped. His skin was changing. Where he'd touched the boulder, his hands were turning gray and hard like stone. The change was spreading up his arms, slowly but steadily. "Joseph!" I grabbed him and tried to pull him away from the rock, but he wouldn't move. "I can see it all," he whispered. "Every memory, every story. The mountain is trying to show us, Libby. It's trying to warn us about what's coming." "What's coming?" But before he could answer, the cliff face cracked open with a sound like thunder. Not just cracked, it opened like a door, revealing a space behind it that shouldn't have existed. Warm air flowed out, carrying scents of pine smoke and sweetgrass and something else, something old. From inside the opening came voices. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, all speaking at once. Cherokee voices, English voices, voices in languages I'd never heard. All of them telling stories, sharing memories, calling out warnings and promises and prayers. And then I saw them. People made of stone and light, walking out of the mountain. Some wore Cherokee clothing, others were dressed like early settlers, and still others looked like they were from even further back in time. All of them were translucent, like ghosts, but their eyes were solid and real and focused on me. "The mountain remembers us all," one of them said, a Cherokee woman with kind eyes. "Every soul who has loved this place becomes part of its memory." "But something is wrong," added a man in pioneer clothes. "The mountain is dying. The memories are fading. If we don't act soon, everything will be lost." I looked around frantically. Joseph was still changing, the stone transformation creeping up toward his shoulders. The spirit people were gathering in a circle around us, their voices mixing together into something that was almost like music. "What do you want me to do?" I shouted over the sound. The Cherokee woman stepped forward. "The mountain needs a guardian, someone to keep the memories safe, someone to speak for those who can no longer speak." She reached out her stone hand toward me, and I knew that if I took it, I would change like Joseph was changing. I would become something between human and mountain, forever. Behind her, the other spirits nodded. "The choice is yours," they said together, "but choose quickly. The mountain's pain grows stronger, and soon it will not be able to hold the memories anymore." That's when I understood. The moved boulders, the voices, the carvings. The mountain wasn't trying to scare us away. It was trying to preserve itself, to save it, the stories and memories before they were lost forever. I stared at the Cherokee woman's outstretched hand, knowing this was the most important decision I'd ever make. Around us, the spirit people waited, their stone and light forms shimmering in the glow from the cliff face. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you listen," she said simply. "You've spent your life learning to read the stories in stone. The mountain has been watching you, learning to trust you." Joseph made a sound beside me, part gasp and part sigh. The transformation had reached his chest now, and his breathing was slowing down. But his eyes were bright and alert, more alive than I'd ever seen them. "Don't be afraid, Libby," he said, his voice echoing strangely as if it came from inside a cave. "I can feel the mountain's memories now. Millions of years of stories, all preserved in crystal and stone. It's beautiful." The ground shook again, harder this time. Cracks appeared in the rocks around us, and I could hear something like crying coming from deep underground. The mountain was in pain. "What's hurting it?" I demanded. The pioneer man stepped forward. "Progress," he said bitterly. "Every year, more development creeps up the slopes, more pollution in the air and water. The mountain has watched species go extinct. Forests get cut down, sacred places get turned into parking lots. It's dying slowly, and when it dies, all the memories die with it." One of the older spirits, dressed in clothes I couldn't identify, spoke up. "We are the mountain's attempt to save itself, the consciousness that has grown over billions of years of existence. But we're running out of time." I looked around at all the spirit faces watching me. These weren't scary ghosts trying to hurt me. They were desperate people trying to save something precious. "If I become the guardian," I said, "what happens to my life? My family?" "You keep your life," the Cherokee woman assured me, "but you gain something more. The ability to speak for the mountain, to protect it, to share its wisdom with the living world. You become a bridge between the ancient consciousness and modern humans." The transformation was spreading faster through Joseph now. His torso was completely stone, shot through with veins of crystal that pulsed with inner light. But he was smiling. "It doesn't hurt," he said, reading the fear in my face. "It's like becoming part of something infinite. All the loneliness goes away." Before I could respond, a new sound split the air. Helicopters. Multiple helicopters, getting closer fast. "Government," the pioneer man spat. "They've detected the geological anomalies. They're coming to study the mountain, to poke and prod and take samples." I could see them now, black helicopters with official markings. They'd be here in minutes, and then this place would be crawling with scientists and soldiers and people who wouldn't understand what they were dealing with. The Cherokee woman's hand was still extended toward me. "Choose now, Libby. Once they arrive, the moment will be lost. The mountain will close itself off again, and the memories will fade." I thought about my 21 years as a ranger, all the hours I'd spent alone with the rocks and trees, feeling like I belonged here more than anywhere else. I thought about my family, who barely understood why I loved the mountains so much. And I thought about Joseph, who was disappearing into stone and light, but looked happier than I'd ever seen him. The helicopters were almost overhead now. I could see ropes being dropped, men in dark suits preparing to rappel down. "If I do this," I said, "can I still protect the mountain from them?" "Better than you ever could as just a human," the woman promised. I reached out and took her hand. The change was immediate, and unlike anything I'd ever felt. Energy flowed up my arm, not painful but overwhelming. I could suddenly feel the mountain's massive consciousness surrounding me, welcoming me. Billions of years of slow, patient thought, millennia of watching ice ages come and go, of feeling every raindrop and every footstep, of storing memories in crystal formations deep in the bedrock. And I could feel its pain, the sadness of watching the world change too fast, of losing connection with the humans who used to understand it, the fear that all its accumulated wisdom would be lost. But now it had hope again. Through me, it could speak. Through me, it could teach people to remember the old ways of respecting the land. The transformation spread through my body, but unlike with Joseph, I didn't become stone. Instead, my skin took on a slight crystalline quality, like tiny gems were embedded just beneath the surface. I could feel my connection to every rock, every cave, every grain of soil on the mountain. The helicopters landed just as the change completed. Men in dark suits and military uniforms came running toward us, shouting orders and pulling out strange equipment. But when they reached the spot where we stood, they stopped short. All they could see was me, standing alone next to some unusual rock formations. Joseph was gone, transformed completely into a beautiful crystal formation that looked like it had been there for centuries. The spirit people had faded back into the stone. The glowing cliff face looked normal again. "Ma'am, you need to evacuate this area immediately," the lead agent said. "We're investigating reports of geological instability." I smiled at him, feeling the mountain's ancient patience flowing through me. "I'm the park ranger assigned to this area," I said calmly. "Elizabeth Mountain Heart. I've been monitoring the geological activity here for weeks. Just some minor seismic adjustments. Nothing dangerous." They questioned me for 2 hours, but I had all the right answers. After all, I really was a geologist, and now I had the mountain's own knowledge to draw from. I could explain every reading on their instruments, predict every tremor, account for every anomaly. Finally, they packed up their equipment and left, filing a report that classified the incidents as natural geological phenomena within normal parameters. As their helicopters disappeared over the horizon, I felt Joseph's presence in the crystal formation beside me. He was happy, more connected to the land than he'd ever been in life. And through our shared connection to the mountain, I knew he would help me learn to be the guardian this place needed. That was 30 years ago now. I'm still a park ranger, still watching over Grandfather Mountain, but everything is different. The crystal patches in my skin glow faintly at night, and I can hear the mountain's thoughts like a constant, gentle whisper in the back of my mind. I don't age the way other people do. The mountain's consciousness keeps me strong and healthy because it needs me to speak for it. My family thinks I'm just really good at my job. When I predict rock slides with perfect accuracy or know exactly where to find lost hikers, they figure I've just developed great instincts over the years. They don't notice that I never get lost in the woods anymore, or that wildlife seems to trust me completely. The government agents came back a few times over the years, following up on reports of strange phenomena. But I always have explanations ready, and the mountain helps me make sure their instruments read exactly what they expect to see. We've gotten good at hiding in plain sight. Joseph visits me sometimes, appearing as a shimmering figure made of crystal and starlight. He's learned so much from the mountain's memories, stories going back to when this land was covered by ancient seas. He's at peace, but he worries about the world changing too fast. "More development is coming," he told me last week. "The mountain shows me plans for a new resort, right on the sacred slopes. You'll need to stop it." And I will. Over the years, I've become an expert at preventing development projects through perfectly legal means. Amazing how many environmental hazards and endangered species you can find when you know exactly where to look. The mountain guides me to the evidence I need. I've also started sharing the mountain's stories with visitors, carefully and subtly. I tell them about the Cherokee memory markers, about the importance of treating old places with respect. Some of them listen. Some of them change how they think about the land. But the mountain is still worried. Climate change is affecting its water table and forest systems. The air pollution is getting worse. And every year, There are more people who see nature as something to be conquered rather than respected. Sometimes late at night when I'm alone on the peak, I can feel other mountains calling out. The whole Appalachian range is connected, it turns out. Ancient consciousnesses that have been sleeping for centuries are starting to wake up, sensing the danger to their world. I think they're choosing guardians, too. Last month I met a forest ranger from West Virginia who had the same crystalline glow in her skin that I do. We didn't talk about it, but we recognized each other. She nodded once, smiled, and went back to her work, protecting an old-growth forest that developers wanted to clear-cut. There are more of us now. Ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, but connected to something much older and deeper. The mountains are preparing for something, though I'm not sure what yet. This morning I found a new crystal formation on my desk at the ranger station. It's shaped like a perfect miniature mountain, and when I look into it, I can see myself giving this interview. Inside the crystal, I'm warning people to pay attention to the signs, to listen when the old places try to speak to them. The mountain is still watching, still remembering, and now it has voices again. If you're ever hiking in old mountains and you feel like the rocks are looking at you, trust that feeling. They are. And they remember every footstep, every breath, every moment in their billion-year exodus. Tense. Maybe they're deciding whether to trust you with their stories too. Maybe they're looking for their next guardian. The mountains are waking up all over Appalachia, and they want their children to come home.